She's not ready. Commander Grant Holloway slammed those 3 words onto the table, like a verdict in front of 7 evaluators, in front of the entire panel while Rachel Bennett's score sheet sat there, the highest in the room, untouched. Nobody argued. Nobody breathed. She had just put 7 rounds through 7 hidden targets in under 12 minutes, in the dark, in the cold, finding angles that trained veterans with binoculars couldn't locate. Perfect. Flawless. Undeniable. And the most powerful man in that room looked straight at the evidence and chose to see something else entirely. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into part 1. Rachel Bennett had been at Quantico for 11 years. She had run every qualification course the FBI offered. She had passed every firearms evaluation, every tactical movement assessment, every stress performance test designed to separate the people who could think clearly under pressure from the ones who couldn't. She had sat through panels and reviews and peer evaluations, and she had come out on the other side of every single one of them with scores that should have ended the conversation before it started. But the conversation never ended. It just kept changing shape. When she was 23, the conversation was about whether she had the physical endurance for extended field operations. She ran a 6-minute mile at 35 pounds of gear in August heat and ended that argument before lunch. When she was 25, the conversation shifted to whether she could perform under live fire stress conditions. She outscored the top 2 male candidates in that evaluation by 8 points and didn't say a word about it afterward. When she was 27, someone had quietly suggested in a review meeting, a meeting she wasn't supposed to know about, that her long-range accuracy might not hold up when lives were actually on the line, when it wasn't steel targets but human decisions. She had heard about the meeting anyway. She always heard things people assumed she wouldn't. Now she was 29, and the conversation had finally arrived at its real destination, Commander Grant Holloway. She had known who he was before she ever walked into his briefing room. Every agent at Quantico knew who Holloway was. He had 26 years with the Bureau, the last 14 running hostage rescue team operations. He had been involved in 41 active threat resolutions. He had a wall of commendations that stretched from the door of his office to the far corner of his desk, and he kept every one of them in plain sight because he believed that leadership required visible authority. What he did not keep in plain sight was what had happened 8 years ago in a farmhouse outside of Roanoke, Virginia, where 2 of his agents had gone in on his order and hadn't come back out. He never talked about it. The after-action report was sealed at his request. His personnel file noted the incident and moved on. But people who had worked closely with Holloway in the years since said that something had shifted in him afterward. He had always been demanding, but after Roanoke, he became something else entirely. He became a man who believed that unpredictability was the source of all catastrophe. That if he controlled every variable, locked down every deviation, reviewed every decision before it was made, then he would never stand outside another building listening to silence where voices should have been. Rachel understood that. She wasn't without compassion. She understood what loss could do to a person who believed that responsibility meant personal accountability for every outcome. But understanding something didn't make it right. And Holloway's fear had been making decisions that should have been made by evidence for years. The night qualification exercise had been scheduled for 3 weeks. Rachel had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, methodically, quietly, thoroughly. She had studied the terrain maps of the Virginia training range until she knew the elevation changes without looking at the numbers. She had reviewed wind pattern data from 3 different weather sources and cross-referenced them with historical records for that specific valley during the same month in previous years. She had spent 2 evenings walking the outer perimeter of the range during daylight, not to see the targets the evaluators would move them before the exercise began. She knew that, but to understand how light behaved in that particular landscape, how shadows formed and shifted, where reflections would appear and disappear as the angle of illumination changed. 7 steel targets. Hidden positions changed after the study period. Evaluators with night vision equipment and binoculars stationed at 3 observation points. Standard exercise for sniper qualification. She had been through versions of it 4 times before, always as a secondary candidate, always being evaluated for a supporting role rather than the primary designation. This time was different. This time the designation on the evaluation sheet read Primary Sniper Hostage Rescue Team Unit 7. This time, if she passed, she would be the first woman assigned in that capacity in the history of that unit. Holloway had made sure she knew the weight of that distinction. Not in a congratulatory way. In the way a man warns you about ice on a road before you've asked about the weather. You understand, he had said in his office 2 days before the exercise, that this evaluation is not a courtesy. It is a final determination. I will not be recommending candidates based on institutional pressure or program optics. I will be recommending the candidate who can perform the function without creating risk. Yes, sir, Rachel had said. That's what I want too. Holloway had looked at her for a long moment. Not the way you look at someone you're assessing. The way you look at something you've already decided you don't trust and you're working backward to find the reason. You've had excellent range scores, he said. I won't deny that. Thank you, sir. Range scores don't tell me what I need to know. What do you need to know, Commander? He had picked up his coffee mug and turned toward the window. Whether you'll hold when it matters. Whether your hands will do what they're supposed to do when what's in your scope is a human being making a decision that kills people you're responsible for. With respect, sir, there's no evaluation that answers that question definitively for anyone. He had looked back at her then. She hadn't meant it as a challenge. It was simply the truth. No range exercise, no stress simulation, no panel review could guarantee how any person, male or female, 20 years of experience or two would perform in the genuine chaos of a real operation. That was the nature of the work. That was why training existed, not to guarantee outcomes, but to build the foundation that gave you a chance. Holloway hadn't responded. He had simply set his mug down and picked up the file folder on his desk, which was the signal in his office that the conversation was finished. She had walked out and gone straight to the range. The night of the evaluation, the temperature dropped to 22 degrees. A thin layer of cloud cover blocked most of the moonlight, but not all of it. The evaluators had specifically chosen a night with partial illumination because it was harder enough light to see, but inconsistent enough to be misleading. Rachel signed in at the command station at 11:40. There were 7 evaluators present, including Holloway, who stood slightly apart from the group with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the particular expression he wore when he had already reached a conclusion and was waiting for events to confirm it. 3 other candidates had completed the exercise earlier in the evening. Rachel had not asked about their scores. It didn't matter what they had done. It only mattered what she would do. At midnight, she was cleared to enter the range. She lay prone on the ridgeline overlooking the valley, her rifle settled against its bipod, her breathing slow and deliberate. The cold didn't bother her the way it bothered some people. She had trained through cold winters in western Maryland, and she had learned years ago that discomfort was information. It told you something about your body's current state, but it wasn't an obstacle unless you allowed it to become one. She acknowledged it and set it aside. The first target took her 4 minutes to locate, not because she was slow, because she was patient. The evaluators had hidden the targets well, better than the previous exercises she had heard described. They had not simply placed steel plates behind obstacles and called it done. They had placed positions that exploited the way the human eye naturally moved across a landscape. Humans, by instinct, followed the expected lines, the obvious ridgeline, the clear gap between trees, the shadow that looked like a break in the cover. The evaluators had understood this and placed 6 of the 7 targets specifically where instinct would not look. Rachel did not follow instinct. She worked on logic. She asked herself a question that most candidates didn't think to ask in a training exercise. Because it felt like overthinking something simple, where would I hide something if I did not want someone to find it? Not where it was difficult to see, where it was easy to dismiss. The first target was behind a cluster of low underbrush at the eastern edge of the valley floor. She found it because she noticed that a branch above the underbrush was bent in a direction inconsistent with the wind. Something had disturbed it not from above, but from below at a specific height. The disturbance was old, from when the target was placed, but the branch hadn't returned to its natural position because the temperature had been below freezing since the setup, and vegetation moved slowly in the cold. She put the first round through the center of the steel plate and moved on. The second target was on the western slope, partially buried in leaves. She found it because the leaves around it were distributed differently than the surrounding forest floor too uniformly. The way leaves look when someone has deliberately scattered them rather than when they have fallen and settled naturally over years. The natural forest floor had layers and inconsistencies and gaps. The patch hiding the second target was too even. The third shot came from a position she almost missed entirely. She had scanned the far northern tree line 3 times and found nothing. On the fourth pass, she slowed down, genuinely slowed down, the way she had trained herself to do when her instinct said there was nothing there. Because her instinct was exactly what the evaluators were trying to exploit, and she caught the reflection. A sliver of moonlight that lasted for less than 2 seconds as the cloud cover briefly shifted, catching the corner of the steel target at an angle that created a single faint point of light about 30 degrees left of where she had been searching. 1 second. A flash of nothing, really. She put the third round through it without hesitation. By target 4, Holloway had moved from his position at the command station and was standing at the primary observation point. She couldn't see him clearly at that distance in the dark, but she had been told afterward by 2 of the other evaluators that he had stopped talking around the time of the second shot and simply watched. The fourth target was the most straightforward, in the sense that it was hidden well, but not deceptively well, placed in a depression on the southern slope behind a fallen log. The challenge was the angle. From her position, she had a narrow window of less than 8 inches between 2 trees to reach the plate. She waited. She calculated. She adjusted for the slight crosswind coming down the slope from the north. The fourth target fell. The fifth and sixth were set as a deliberate trap. They were placed approximately 40 yards apart on the eastern ridge, positioned so that engaging the fifth would require her to shift her body weight in a way that would disrupt her sight line to the sixth if she moved too quickly. It was a test of whether she understood that clean accuracy required you to plan 2 decisions ahead, not 1. She engaged the fifth, held her position, let her breathing complete its cycle, and shifted deliberately and slowly to the sixth. 8 seconds between the 2 shots. Longer than most candidates would have waited, she suspected. But both plates fell clean. The seventh was the one she almost didn't find. It wasn't hidden on the valley floor or the slopes or the tree line. The evaluators had placed it inside the ruins of an old stone observation post at the far western end of the range, a structure she had noticed during her daytime walk, but had categorized as a landmark, rather than a position because it was too obvious, too close, too easy a choice for a training scenario. But that was exactly what made it brilliant. They had placed the hardest target in the easiest location, knowing that candidates would mentally eliminate the obvious and spend their time searching the complex. She had almost done the same thing. She had assigned the observation post to the bottom of her priority list and nearly run through her entire search sequence before coming back to it. She found it because of shadow geometry. The cloud cover had shifted again, and the angle of moonlight coming across the valley fell into the observation post opening at an angle that should have created a shadow inside the structure. The shadow wasn't there. Something inside the post was blocking it. She held her breath. She placed the crosshair. She waited for her heartbeat to settle into the quiet space between contractions. The seventh target fell. 7 shots, 7 plates, 0 misses. 11 minutes and 47 seconds total time. She lay in position for another full minute after the 7th shot, keeping her eye behind the optic, verifying that each high target had fallen, counting her own breathing, letting the adrenaline acknowledge itself and then subside, because she had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous moment for a sniper wasn't the shot. It was the moment right after, when the brain wanted to celebrate instead of staying alert. Then she unloaded, cleared the chamber, engaged the safety, stood up, and walked back to the command station. The evaluators were quiet, not the quiet of discomfort. The quiet of people recalibrating something they had expected to say that they could no longer say. Holloway was standing at the edge of the group. His arms were no longer crossed. He had a coffee thermos in one hand, and he was looking at her in a way she had not seen from him before, not admiration, not quite, but something like the expression of a man who has been presented with a fact he is not yet ready to incorporate. She signed the evaluation log and waited. The senior evaluator, a man named Prescott, who had run the sniper program for 6 years, walked over to her and shook her hand without saying anything extraordinary. He just shook her hand and nodded. That was enough. That was, in its quiet way, everything. Then Holloway cleared his throat. Good shooting, he said, 2 words. Flat. Not cold, he wasn't being deliberately dismissive. He was a man trying to be fair while fighting everything inside him that didn't want to be. Thank you, Commander. The panel will deliberate tomorrow morning, he said. You'll have an answer by noon. She nodded and said nothing else. She drove back to the barracks, alone that night, the range dust still on her jacket, The cold settled into her knuckles from the grip. She didn't call anyone. She didn't tell anyone what had happened, even though her hands were steady and her mind was clear. And some part of her had known, since the seventh target fell, what the clean outcome meant. She sat on the edge of her bunk and opened her notebook. She wrote down every detail of the exercise: the wind reading at midnight, the temperature, the cloud cover patterns, where each target had been placed, and what had led her to each one, how long each shot had taken, how many times she had paused and why. She wrote it all down, not because she was afraid she would forget it. She wrote it down because she had learned, early in her career, that the moments when institutions tried to deny what had happened were the moments when you needed documentation more than memory. The panel met at 9 the following morning. Rachel was not in the room. She found out later what was said, not from anyone who was supposed to tell her, but from the pattern of silences and expressions she observed over the following hours, which was a kind of information she had become fluent in a long time ago. She could read a hallway the way some people read a room. Prescott had recommended certification immediately. Two other evaluators had agreed. One had been hesitant, but had said he could not find grounds for objection based on the performance. One had been absent from the vote for a reason that was never fully explained. Holloway had not recommended certification. He had used the exact phrase that someone later repeated to her verbatim, because people in organizations always leaked the exact phrases that mattered most. She's accurate, but she's not ready. She had heard it 4 hours to the panel concluded, from a junior evaluator who had the decency to be uncomfortable about it. She had sat with it in silence for a long moment. Then she had gone back to the range and run the qualification exercise again. Alone this time, no targets. Just the movement patterns, how she had moved from position to position, where she had waited, where she had been too slow, where she had been efficient. She ran it until she understood every weakness in her own process that the exercise had revealed, and then she went back to the barracks and wrote those down too. Holloway's decision did not break her, but it clarified something. She had spent years believing that if she performed well enough, consistently enough, the conversation would eventually end. That evidence would be sufficient. That competence demonstrated in sufficient quantity would overcome the resistance of people who had decided their conclusions before the evidence arrived. She still believed in competence. She still believed in evidence. But she had stopped believing that either one on its own was sufficient to move people who had decided that their fear mattered more than what was in front of them. The thing that was going to change Holloway's mind, if anything was not another perfect score. It was a situation in which no amount of rigid control could protect him from the consequence of being wrong. She didn't know, sitting on that range in Virginia, that the situation was already being assembled 2,000 miles away. She didn't know about the mining settlement in western Montana, or the extremist group that had spent 6 months planning an operation that would look like a hostage rescue opportunity and function as an ambush. She didn't know about the 3 people who would be taken from a survey site on a freezing Tuesday morning: a federal hydrologist named Carla Weston, a land management geologist named James Park, and a local physician named Dr. Arthur Reeves, who had been on the site to assess potential flooding risks in the nearby community and who would spend the worst nights of his life in a reinforced maintenance shed, listening to wind and waiting to find out whether he would see his grandchildren again. She didn't know about any of that yet. She only knew what Owen Mercer told her a week later when he knocked on her door with 2 coffees and a look on his face that meant something had moved from the planning stage to the operational stage, and that the window for planning had narrowed considerably. Owen was 41. He had done 7 years in Army reconnaissance before moving to the Bureau, and he had worked with Rachel as her primary spotter for 3 years, which meant he was one of the few people who had watched her work from close enough to understand what he was actually seeing. Most people, watching Rachel operate, saw a young woman being technically proficient. Owen saw something different. He saw someone who processed information in the field the way a chess player processed a board, not move by move, but patterns, consequences of patterns, the shape of what was missing. He trusted her judgment in a way that Holloway didn't, and probably never would. He had tried to explain this to Holloway once, after a joint training exercise 18 months earlier, and Holloway had listened patiently and then said, "Skill and judgment are different things, Owen. I'll let you know when I've seen evidence of both." Owen had not argued. He had simply walked away, which was his version of an argument. Montana, Owen said when she opened her door and handed her the coffee, and she took it without asking any questions. Because the look on his face meant that explanations were coming, and that the explanations were going to require both hands free. She stepped back and let him in. He set a folder on her table, not a classified file. He wasn't supposed to have those outside the briefing room, but a stack of printed satellite images and terrain notes he had been given in his own briefing earlier that morning. She sat across from him and he walked her through it. 2 federal geologists and a physician. Abducted 3 days ago from a survey site near a decommissioned copper mining settlement in the Rattlesnake Ridge Basin in western Montana, approximately 60 miles from the Canadian border. The abduction group was a domestic extremist organization that law enforcement had been monitoring for 11 months, following 3 incidents in Wyoming and Idaho. Their current demand was simple: release of their imprisoned founder within 72 hours, or they would begin what their communication described as demonstrations. Nobody in the Bureau needed the word defined. The hostages were confirmed alive as of 36 hours ago based on a cell signal that had briefly cleared the terrain and connected for 48 seconds before disappearing again. Aerial surveillance was limited. The basin sat inside a natural interference zone that can combine mountain pufafri with the EM signature of the old mining equipment still in place underground. Drone coverage was unreliable. Satellite imagery showed the general layout of the settlement, but nothing about internal positions or guard movements. A winter storm system was moving in from Canada. They had approximately 48 hours before weather conditions would make aerial extraction impossible. The team going in was Unit 7 of the hostage rescue team, Holloway's unit. Rachel stared at the terrain photographs for a long time after Owen finished. She picked up each one and looked at it carefully, not for the obvious information, the building locations, the road access, the tree-lined perimeter, but for the things that didn't fit, the inconsistencies, the details that were almost right but not quite. She found the first one in the 3rd photograph, a section of tree line along the upper northern ridge where the snow pattern beneath the trees was different from the surrounding area. Lighter, more uniform. Snow accumulated on the ground beneath pine trees in a specific pattern determined by how the branches distributed precipitation. The pattern she was looking at didn't match the tree density visible from above. Someone had been underneath those trees recently, moving, standing, repositioning, and had disturbed the natural accumulation. She set that photograph aside and picked up the next one. Owen, she said. Yeah. What do we know about the natural access routes into the basin? He pointed them out: the main valley road from the south, a fire access track from the east that ended at a creek crossing, and a service road from the west that was shown on the maps as decommissioned in 2009. 9. What do you know about the service road? Officially closed. Bridge over the creek replaced with a concrete ford. The approach is narrow, single vehicle at most. She held up the 4th photograph. Someone's been using it. Look at the tree line on the western slope. Those lower branches, they're broken on the uphill side. That's a vehicle passing beneath them from below, going uphill, not from above. Owen took the photograph and looked at it for a moment. Could be wildlife at 12 feet of elevation, on branches that required horizontal force to break. He said nothing. They've got a vehicle route out, Rachel said. One they didn't tell anyone about, going west toward the border. And look at this. She spread 3 photographs across the table and pointed at a series of heat signatures on the thermal overlay. These 2 signatures are near the main building, where you'd expect guards to be. But these, she pointed to 2 clusters of faint thermal readings far up the northern ridge, well above the settlement. These are in positions that don't make sense for defensive coverage of the settlement. They make sense for coverage of the approach route from the command post. Owen looked at her. She met his eyes. This isn't a hostage situation with guards, she said. The hostages are at the center. The guards are on the perimeter. The perimeter is facing outward, not to keep the hostages in, but to funnel anyone coming in. Owen set the photograph down slowly. You think it's a trap. I think it's designed to look like a rescue opportunity and function as something else entirely, she said. I think the positions on that upper ridge are there to close off the escape route after a response team enters the basin. The real question is how many positions there are and where exactly they've set them. Owen was quiet for a moment. Holloway's not going to see it that way. No, Rachel agreed. He's going to say you're creating a threat profile out of pattern recognition and incomplete data. Probably. He might be right. She picked up the 4th photograph again and looked at the broken branches. He might be, she said, but I'm not going to know for certain until we're in position on that ridge and I can look at it myself. Owen nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee and drank it and didn't say anything else for a minute. Outside, it was starting to rain, a cold November rain that would turn to snow before morning, which was exactly the kind of weather that made everything harder and nothing more forgiving. We're going as secondary, he said finally. You know that. Holloway made that decision when the unit assignment came down. Observer status. I know. He's not going to authorize a shot from that distance in those conditions on threats that haven't opened fire yet. I know, Owen. So what's your plan? She folded the photographs carefully and put them back in the stack. She picked up her notebook, the same notebook she had been writing in since the night of the qualification exercise, and opened it to a clean page. My plan, she said, is to document everything I observe, communicate it clearly, and operate within my authority. Owen watched her write. And if your authority isn't enough, he asked. She didn't answer immediately. She kept writing neat, precise, methodical entries: terrain analysis, thermal pattern assessment, vehicle route hypothesis, defensive position estimate. When she was done with the page, she looked up. Then I'll make a decision, she said, and I'll accept the consequences of it, whatever they are. Owen held her gaze for a long moment. Then he reached across the table, picked up the fourth photograph, and looked at the broken branches on the western slope one more time. All right, he said quietly. Then let's make sure we're in the right position to see everything clearly. She nodded and turned to the next page in her notebook. There was a lot more to document before morning. The team briefing took place 2 days later, the evening before deployment. 22 agents, 3 tactical planners, 2 communication specialists, a medical unit, and Holloway at the front of the room with a topographical map projected on the screen behind him. Rachel sat in the third row with Owen beside her, and her notebook open on her knee. She had prepared 3 pages of analysis to present during the question period: her identification of the probable false guard positions, the vehicle route evidence, the thermal pattern inconsistencies, the probability assessment she had built from the satellite data. She had been careful. She had sourced every observation, qualified every conclusion, distinguished between what she could confirm from the data and what she was inferring. She had done everything right. Holloway opened the floor to questions after his overview. She raised her hand and he called on her. She presented her analysis clearly and methodically, in the same tone she would have used presenting evidence to the panel, not arguing, not advocating, simply placing the information in front of the group and walking through the reasoning. Holloway listened without interrupting. The room was quiet. Several agents were leaning slightly forward. When she finished, Holloway looked at the topographical map for a moment. Then he looked at her. You're reading vehicle disturbance into what satellite imagery shows as branch deflection, he said. That could be wind. That could be animal movement. That could be image artifact. Yes, sir, I noted those alternatives. The weight of the combined pattern suggests. The weight of the combined pattern, Holloway said, is 3 data points and a hypothesis. I'm not adjusting a tactical plan for a 3-man rescue operation based on inference. The room held its breath. I'm not asking you to adjust the plan, Rachel said carefully. I'm asking for consideration of secondary positions on the upper ridge to cover the approach corridor, in the event that my assessment has merit. If every secondary assessment required an adjustment to primary positioning, we'd never execute an operation, Holloway said. Your observation role provides additional intelligence coverage. That's the appropriate use of your skill set for this mission. She closed her notebook. Understood, Commander. Daniel Cross, seated 2 rows ahead of her, turned his head slightly in her direction. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He had been listening to the exchange with the careful attention of a man who was doing his own calculus, weighing Holloway's authority against the quiet clarity of Rachel's analysis, filing both of them in a place where he would return to them when he needed to make a decision. The briefing concluded at 9 in the evening. Teams were scheduled for departure at 300. At 11 that night, Daniel Cross found Rachel in the equipment room and stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke. I read your analysis, he said. She looked up from the scope she was cleaning. I didn't circulate it. No. But the notes you gave the intelligence team went through the shared drive. I have access. He paused. I want you to know I read it carefully. Okay. He was quiet for a moment. He had the particular expression of a man who was choosing his words slowly, not because he didn't know what he wanted to say, but because he wanted to say it accurately. You're right about the northern ridge, he said. I don't know for certain. But if I had to bet on it, don't bet, Daniel. Just be ready to move fast if I turn out to be right. He almost smiled. Not quite. The weight of what was coming was too present for a full smile. I've got 2 agents with young kids, he said. Brennan and Holt. I need them to come home. I know. I trust your eyes out there, he said. Whatever Holloway authorizes or doesn't, I trust your judgment on what you're seeing. She looked at him for a moment. Don't make me responsible for your decision, she said quietly. I can tell you what I see. You have to decide what to do with it. That's how this is supposed to work. He nodded. Fair enough. He started to leave, then stopped. For what it's worth, I read those 7 qualification reports too. All 4 of them. Every evaluator except one agreed. She didn't respond, he left. She finished cleaning the scope, checked the chamber, set the rifle in its case, and picked up her notebook again. She wrote at the top of the new page, in her neat, precise hand, the time and date and location 11:14 p.m. Helena, Montana, and then, below it, in a line she underlined once, 7 positions identified. Communication failure likely. Weather window closing. She did not write what she was afraid of. She didn't need to. The page knew. The careful lines and precise documentation and quiet, methodical entries said what she would not say aloud, which was this. She was going into a basin that might be designed to kill people she had been working alongside for 3 years under the authority of a man who had already decided she was a secondary concern. In weather conditions that would cut off aerial support within hours. And she was going to have to do her job perfectly regardless. She closed the notebook, set it in her kit bag, and went to bed. She slept 4 hours, dreamless, quiet, flat sleep. The kind of sleep that came not from peace but from discipline, the practiced ability to rest the body regardless of what the mind was carrying. At 230, her alarm went off. She dressed in the dark, methodically, the way she had done hundreds of times before: base layer, thermal mid-layer, waterproof outer shell, knee pads, gloves, balaclava. She checked her rifle case, her spotting equipment, her communications gear, her emergency kit. She inventoried everything twice. She ate half a protein bar, because it was protocol to eat before deployment, even when eating felt irrelevant. At 255, she shouldered her pack, picked up her rifle case, and walked out into the Montana cold. The stars were gone. The storm front had moved in earlier than forecast. The sky above the valley was a flat, solid gray that absorbed the darkness without giving anything back, and the temperature had dropped 12 degrees since the briefing. Owen was waiting by the vehicles. He had his own pack on and a thermos in each hand, and he held one out to her without a word. She took it. They drove toward the Rattlesnake Ridge Basin in silence. Somewhere in that basin, 3 people who had done nothing wrong were sitting in a cold building, waiting to find out whether anyone was coming for them. Rachel pressed her back against the vehicle seat and felt the thermos warming her hands and thought about the northern ridge and the broken branches and the 7 positions she had identified and the ones she might have missed. She thought about Daniel Cross, who trusted her judgment. She thought about Holloway, who didn't. She thought about the woman she had been at 23, running qualification courses in August heat, and the woman she was now, sitting in the dark with her notebook and her rifle and 11 years of everything she had refused to give up. She thought about the first target, and the bent branch, and the shadow that wasn't where it should have been. Then she stopped thinking and started watching. That was in the end what she did best. The convoy left Helena at 310. 3 vehicles. No sirens, no lights beyond the low beams cutting through the dark. The road north was empty at that hour, which meant Rachel could hear everything: the engine, the tires on wet asphalt, Owen's breathing in the seat beside her, the occasional crackle of the communications channel running through the tactical earpiece she had already threaded into place. She had learned a long time ago that the quietest moments before an operation were the ones that told you the most about what was coming. Not because silence was ominous. Sometimes silence was just silence, but because the way people filled silence said everything about where their heads were. In the second vehicle, Holloway was on a call with the command post, running through the final communications check. She could hear fragments of it through the open channel. His voice was controlled, professional. The voice of a man who had done this enough times that the mechanics of preparation had become automatic. But underneath the professionalism was something she had learned to recognize in the 3 months since joining Unit 7, a tightness, a compression, like a man holding himself together at very high pressure. Daniel Cross was in the lead vehicle with Brennan and Holt and 4 other agents. She couldn't hear his voice, but she had seen his face at the vehicle check 20 minutes earlier, and he had the particular expression she associated with experienced field agents the night before an operation that they weren't entirely sure about. Not fear. Something more complicated than fear. The look of a man doing math in his head and not being fully satisfied with the answer. Owen was quiet beside her. He had the terrain map open on his knee, a physical copy, because the electronic versions had shown interference anomalies in 2 pre-mission checks, and he didn't trust them, and he was running his finger along the approach corridor for the 7th time that evening. He wasn't looking for new information. He was burning the information he had into a place where he could access it without thinking, because the moment you needed to think about the terrain was the moment you didn't have time to think about anything else. "Wind's going to be a problem," he said, not looking up. "I know. The storm system is tracking northeast faster than the morning forecast said. By the time we're in position, we're going to have gusts at the ridge. Could be 15, could be 22. Could be 30, she said. He finally looked up. Could be 30, he agreed. You want to talk about the shooting solution? Not yet. She kept her eyes forward. I want to see the terrain first. The maps are good, but they're not the same. Never are. She was quiet for a moment, then she said the 7th position in my analysis. I placed it on the upper northern ridge, east cluster, covering the approach corridor. But I'm not satisfied with that. Owen folded the map slightly. Why not? Because if I were setting this up, she said slowly, I wouldn't put my best position where anyone looking at the ridge with a basic overlay would think to look first. I'd put it somewhere that requires a different kind of attention to find, somewhere that looks already accounted for. She paused. I keep coming back to that mine office building at the western edge of the settlement. It's visible on the satellite imagery. It's the obvious thing, which is exactly why everyone's dismissed it as a firing position. Owen was, if they have one shooter in that building, she said, at that elevation relative to the extraction route. At the moment, a team is trying to move hostages across the open ground between the maintenance shed and the vehicles. That's not a problem. That's a catastrophe. You can't confirm that from the satellite data. No, she said, I can't. Holloway's going to say the same thing. Holloway's going to say a lot of things, she said. I need to be in position on the ridge before any of them matter. They drove the rest of the way in silence. At 410, they turned off the paved road onto the fire access track that approached the basin from the east. The track was rough, frozen ruts from vehicle traffic weeks earlier, overlaid with fresh snow that had softened and refrozen into irregular ridges that made the vehicle rock unevenly. Rachel braced herself against the door and felt the cold seeping through the metal, and she thought about the 3 people in that maintenance shed who had been there for days, in conditions far worse than a cold vehicle on a rough road, with no certainty about what was coming and no way to know whether anyone was looking for them. She thought about Dr. Arthur Reeves, the physician. The briefing notes had included a brief personal profile, 61 years old, general practice, 30 years in the same rural community. He had a daughter in Missoula and 2 grandchildren, ages 4 and 7. He had been on the survey site as a volunteer because the community flood risk assessment was something he had lobbied the county commission to conduct for 3 years, and when the federal team had finally come out to do it, he had wanted to be there. He was there. He had been there for 72 hours now. She stopped thinking about it and focused on the terrain. At 448, the convoy stopped at the designated staging area, approximately 2.5 miles from the basin perimeter. Vehicles were concealed under tree cover. The team assembled in the cold darkness for a final pre-insertion check. Holloway ran the check himself. He was precise, methodical, relentlessly thorough ammunition counts, communications frequencies, medical kit inventory, extraction timing, abort signal protocols. He was the best operational commander she had ever seen in terms of pure preparation. That was never the question. The question was always what happened when preparation met a reality that hadn't cooperated with the plan. He walked down the line of agents and stopped in front of Rachel and Owen. Observer position is on the eastern ridge spur, he said. Elevation gives you coverage of the main settlement, the maintenance shed, and the western vehicle approach. You'll relay thermal and visual updates every 4 minutes on the primary channel. Understood, Rachel said. Commander, I want to request a modified position. 40 meters north of the designated spur would give us a wider angle on the upper northern ridge, which is my primary concern based on each. The designated position provides adequate coverage for the operation as planned, Holloway said. His voice was level. Not unkind, just closed. Stay on the spur. Sir, if my assessment of the secondary firing positions is correct, the spur gives us coverage of 5 of the 7 probable positions. The northern cluster is a probable position based on satellite ambiguity. Agent Bennett. He held her gaze for one deliberate moment. I've reviewed your analysis. I don't dismiss it. But I'm not restructuring a tactical deployment at 0453 based on inference. You'll operate from the designated position, you'll report what you observe, and you will not fire without explicit authorization. Am I clear? He moved on down the line. Owen stepped slightly closer to her. He's not wrong that we don't have confirmation, he said quietly. He's not wrong, she agreed. He's just wrong about what to do with uncertainty. They separated from the main group at 505 and began the climb to the ridge. The terrain was harder than the satellite imagery had suggested it almost always was. The slope was steep enough that they were moving in a low crouch for most of the ascent, using their hands on the frozen rock and root systems to maintain balance without creating noise. The snow was intermittent, deep in the hollows and thin on the exposed sections, which meant alternating between the silent cushion of deep snow and the terrifying crunch of ice-covered rock that seemed, in the absolute quiet of the pre-dawn mountain, loud enough to carry for half a mile. It wasn't. Acoustics in that terrain worked in their favor. Sound scattered in the basin rather than carrying up the slope. But knowing that and feeling it were different things, and every crack of ice underfoot tightened something in Rachel's chest that she had to consciously and deliberately release before the next step. At 541, they reached the designated spur and settled into position. Rachel set up the rifle on its bipod and brought the optic up to her eye without turning on the thermal overlay yet. She wanted to see the settlement the way it looked naturally first, before adding the additional data layer. She had learned this years ago: see the whole picture before you start breaking it into pieces, because the pieces only make sense in the context of the whole. The settlement was still. A cluster of structures spread across the basin floor: the main building, the maintenance shed, two storage structures, the collapsed section of the old service yard, and at the far western edge, the mine office. The operational notes had identified the maintenance shed as the most probable hostage location, based on its reinforced construction and single entry point. Two heat signatures near the main building entrance confirmed guard activity there. A third signature was visible near the maintenance shed, also a guard. Standard defensive configuration. Exactly what the briefing had anticipated. Exactly. Rachel ran her scan along the northern tree line, moving slowly, methodically. She was looking for the pattern she had identified in the satellite photographs, the disrupted snow accumulation beneath the pines on the upper ridge. At this distance, in this light, the detail was finer than the aerial imagery, and for 40 seconds she found nothing that confirmed her assessment. Then she found the first one. It wasn't the disrupted snow that gave it away. It was the absence of the disrupted snow in a place where, given the tree density and the wind pattern, disruption should have existed. A section of the ridge where the accumulation pattern was too uniform, too undisturbed, as if the natural process of overnight wind drift and temperature variation had been arrested, which could happen if something was in position beneath those trees holding the snow in place. A body, equipment, a thermal hide. Owen, she said quietly. Upper northern ridge. 11 o'clock from the main building. 60 meters east of the rock outcropping. Owen had his spotting scope up. 12 seconds of silence. I've got some disturbance in the accumulation. Could be. There's one there, she said. I need the thermal overlay. She switched to thermal. The upper ridge was colder than the basin floor, which meant the ambient temperature was suppressing the signatures. But there it was, a faint, low-temperature red, barely distinguishable from the surrounding rock and vegetation, in exactly the position she had identified. Not the bright signature of an active body in motion, but the muted signature of someone who had been in position long enough that their thermal output had partially equilibrated with the environment. A practiced, disciplined concealment. This was not an amateur. She ran the overlay across the full arc of her coverage and found 3 more positions in the following 4 minutes. 2 on the northern ridge, 1 on the eastern slope, all showing the same suppressed signature pattern. They weren't moving. They were waiting. Her stomach dropped. She keyed her radio command. Observer 1. I have multiple confirmed thermal signatures in elevated positions on the northern ridge and eastern slope. These are not consistent with civilian activity. Requesting immediate review of tactical deployment. Holloway's voice came back in 17 seconds. Observer 1, elaborate on signature confidence. Suppressed thermal profiles, consistent with practiced concealment. Minimum 3 positions on the ridge, 1 on the eastern slope. 2 main building guards are confirmed, plus the maintenance shed position. That is at least 6 total. I believe there are more I haven't located yet. A pause. 8 seconds. Stand by, Observer 1. Owen was running the spotting scope across the western slope. Rachel, he said very quietly. Look at the mine office. Second floor window, left side. She shifted her optic. The mine office was 300 yards to her left and 400 vertical feet below her position at the far western edge of the settlement. The second floor window was dark. But for 1 second, less than 1 second, there was a barely perceptible change in the condensation pattern on the cracked glass, as if someone on the other side had shifted close to it, as if warm breath from inside the room had altered the temperature at the glass surface just enough to change the frost pattern. She held on it. Nothing. 15 seconds of nothing. "Holloway," she said on the radio. "I need to flag the mine office as a potential interior position. Second floor, left window. I had a thermal anomaly, brief. I cannot confirm. Roger, Observer 1. I am reviewing your signature data with the tactical lead now. Hold position, hold position." She held position. At 611, Holloway came back on the channel. "Observer 1, tactical lead confirms the Northern Ridge data is inconclusive without drone verification. We are working to restore the secondary drone feed. Assault element will hold at the primary staging point until we have visual confirmation or a 12-minute window expires." 12 minutes. She knew what 12 minutes meant in real terms. The storm was accelerating. The communications window was already narrowing. If they waited 12 minutes for a drone feed that might or might not clear the interference, they might be making the assault decision in worse conditions with less preparation time, which was the exact opposite of what additional intelligence was supposed to accomplish. "Commander," she said, "the window is shorter than 12 minutes. The storm front is tracking northeast. We have perhaps 8 minutes before the temperature drop closes the thermal overlay and reduces my effective range by 30%. If the drone doesn't come online in 4 minutes, the surveillance advantage is gone regardless. Longer this time." "Understood, Observer 1. 4-minute drone window. If no visual by 0616, assault element moves at 0618. 4 minutes." She kept her optic on the northern ridge and counted. The drone came online at 614. Partial. The feed was fragmented, not the clean overhead view that would confirm positions, but a broken, stuttering image that showed the general layout and nothing specific about the upper ridge. The communications specialist at the command post spent 90 seconds trying to stabilize it and got 40% coverage before it dropped out entirely. 40% coverage. None of it on the northern ridge. Holloway called it. Assault element moves at 618. Rachel pressed her eye harder against the optic and ran the thermal overlay one more time across every position she had identified. 4 confirmed, 2 probable, 1 unconfirmed interior. 6, maybe 7. The assault element was 13 agents moving into a basin that might have 7 armed positions waiting to close behind them. "Owen," she said, "Yeah, when they enter, I need you on the northern ridge continuously. Call me every change in position, every shift, every movement, anything that breaks the pattern." On it. He had his spotting scope up before she finished the sentence. At 618, Daniel Cross led the assault element into the basin. She watched them through the optic, moving in a spread formation, using the available tree cover on the valley floor. They were good. Professional. Quiet in their movement, disciplined in their spacing. She tracked them as they crossed the open section near the collapsed service yard, expecting fire, holding her breath, and nothing came. That was when she knew for certain. If the positions on the northern ridge were there to engage the team on approach, the approach was the moment to fire. The team was exposed, crossing open ground in a loose formation. It was the best opportunity the concealed positions would have, and they hadn't taken it, which meant the concealment wasn't designed to stop the team from entering. It was designed to stop them from leaving. She keyed her radio immediately. "Command, Observer 1. Assault element has crossed the open section without contact. I am reassessing threat posture. I believe the elevated positions are designated to close the extraction route, not to prevent entry. Recommend issuing extraction protocol contingency to assault element now, before they reach the structure." Holloway responded in 9 seconds, which was fast for him. "Observer 1, what is your confidence on that assessment?" "High," she said. The approach window was the optimal engagement opportunity, and it was not used. That is not consistent with a static defensive posture. That is consistent with a controlled funnel. 4 seconds of silence on the channel. "Assault element will continue to primary objective," Holloway said. "Your assessment is noted." Noted. Daniel's team reached the main building at 628. Owen reported no movement on the northern ridge. The 4 confirmed positions remained static. The 2 probable positions on the eastern slope showed no change. The mine office window showed nothing. The team entered the building. At 629 and 40 seconds, two things happened simultaneously. The drone feed, the partial fragmentary drone feed that had been offline and had briefly reconnected before dropping out again, disappeared completely. Not degraded. Gone. In the earpiece, the communications specialist said, in a voice that was professionally controlled but unmistakably alarmed, "Command, we've lost the drone. Signal is blocked. Someone is jamming the frequency." And Owen said quietly and immediately, "Movement. Northern Ridge. East Cluster. The first position is active." Rachel's right hand moved to her grip. Ware shifting left, coming to a new angle. They're repositioning for Rachel. They're repositioning for the extraction route. The building exit. The moment that team comes back out. "Command, Observer 1. Her voice was flat and urgent. "Northern Ridge position is active and repositioning. Assault element is going to have a firing solution on the extraction route the moment they attempt to move the hostages. We need authorization to engage the Ridge position now, before it completes its movement." Holloway's voice came back, and for the first time she heard something in it she had not heard before, not uncertainty, but the sound of a man whose system was failing and who was reaching for control in the only way he knew how. "Observer 1, I do not have visual on the Northern Ridge. I cannot authorize an engagement without visual confirmation from my position. Sir, with respect, your position does not have the angle. My position does. I am giving you the visual confirmation. Your thermal data is not sufficient for an engagement authorization at that range in these conditions. It is not thermal data. It is direct optic observation. The position is repositioning. I need authorization now. Hold your position, Agent Bennett. I am working to restore aerial coverage." And then the second device went offline. The communications repeater, the ground-based signal booster that had been placed to compensate for the terrain interference, went silent. Not degraded. Switched off. By someone who knew exactly where it was and had been waiting for the right moment to take it down. The tactical channel filled with static for 3 seconds and then went to a lower quality emergency frequency that had a 3-second transmission delay and required manual key activation for every message. In practical terms, it meant that coordinated real-time communication between the command post and the assault element was effectively gone. And Daniel Cross's team was inside the building. Owen's voice was very quiet. "They're going to open up the moment that team finds the room empty and starts to reverse." She had 1 second to understand everything she was looking at. The room would be empty. She had said so in the brief, and she was right. And Daniel Cross was going to walk into a dark room with no hostages in it and understand immediately that something was wrong. And he was going to turn his team around and try to get them back to the extraction point. And the moment they did, 7 people on the ridgeline and in the basin were going to close every route out of that basin simultaneously. And Holloway was asking her to hold position while he tried to restore a drone feed that someone had deliberately jammed. Owen turned his head and looked at her. Just looked at her. He didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that hadn't already been said. He knew what the choice was. He knew what it cost. He was looking at her the way you look at someone you trust to make the right decision, and you are grateful, in that moment, not to be the one making it. Rachel said on the degraded emergency channel, with full awareness that the 3-second delay would put her words into Holloway's ear, after she had already moved, "Commander, I am declaring an immediate threat to life under active threat protocol. I am engaging the active Northern Ridge position. Recording in progress." Then she exhaled, placed her crosshair on the repositioned figure on the Northern Ridge, and waited the half-second that discipline required between the decision and the shot. The figure on the ridge had the barrel of a rifle clearing the tree cover. Rachel's first shot broke the silence. The barrel dropped. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. The basin held its breath. The storm held its breath. The 7 concealed positions held their positions, and the assault team was still inside the building, and Holloway was in the command post with a dead drone feed and a 3-second channel delay and the full weight of a situation that had stopped. Following his plan at the moment, the communications repeater went offline. Then the second position moved, and the third, and the basin exploded into motion. The tactical channel came alive with fragmented voices. Cross calling contact, Brennan calling movement, someone on the eastern slope returning fire at a position that hadn't revealed itself yet. The emergency frequency was a wall of overlapping transmissions that required manual sorting, and the 3-second delay turned every piece of information into something that was already 30 seconds out of date before anyone could act on it. Holloway's voice came through, controlled but stripped of the professional calm that had been its defining quality for 26 years. Observer 1, cease fire. I repeat, cease fire until I can establish. The eastern slope position opened up on the path between the main building and the maintenance shed. Rachel had it in her optic in 4 seconds. A figure in a concealed thermal suit, prone behind a rock formation she had flagged as a probable position, firing toward the sound of movement near the building. Daniel Cross's voice on the emergency channel. We're taking fire from the east slope. We have the hostages, I repeat. We have the hostages. Maintenance shed was unlocked. Reeves is injured. He cannot move on his own. We need the extraction route clear. The extraction route. The mine office window. Rachel shifted left without taking her eye from the optic. The eastern position was moving. She had 3 seconds before it would have a clear line on the main building exit. She didn't have 3 seconds to ask for authorization. She had never been going to have 3 seconds to ask for authorization. And some part of her had known that since she sat in Owen's car 2 days ago, looking at a photograph of broken branches on a western slope. The second shot stopped the eastern position. Holloway was saying something on the emergency channel, but the 3-second delay and the overlapping transmissions made it incomprehensible. Owen was calling adjustments, range, wind. The storm was pushing the gusts now, intermittent but hitting 20 at the ridge. And she was processing him the way she processed everything in the field, not consciously, not deliberately, just absorbing and compensating, letting 11 years of practice handle the technical variables while her mind stayed focused on the pattern. The pattern was telling her something. She shifted her scan across the full basin. 2 positions down, 5 remaining. Cross and his team were moving out of the main building with 3 hostages, Reeves between 2 agents, arms over their shoulders, his feet dragging toward the extraction point. To get there, they had to cross 45 yards of open ground between the main building and the vehicle staging area. 45 yards was an eternity. She keyed the emergency channel. Assault element, hold your position. Do not cross the open section yet. I have active positions covering the crossing. Wait for my signal. Cross came back immediately, his voice lower than usual, tight, the voice of a man managing chaos and managing it well. Observer 1 acknowledged. We have a timer. Reeves needs medical attention. We cannot hold more than 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Give me 2. She go. She went. The 3rd and 4th positions on the northern ridge had shifted during the first 2 shots, moving to new firing angles, exactly what she had expected. Exactly what she had told Owen to watch for. They weren't fleeing. They were adapting. These were not frightened people firing in panic. These were disciplined, trained individuals who had built a plan and were executing it, adjusting in real time. The 3rd position had moved to a shallow depression behind the rock outcropping on the northeastern edge of the ridge. She had spotted the depression on the satellite imagery and noted it in her documentation as an alternate concealment option for that section of the ridge. She had even written the specific grid coordinate in her notebook. She found it in 9 seconds. Owen gave her the wind correction, 17 knots, northeast, intermittent gusts to 23, and she held for a gust cycle, waited for the brief calm between surges, and put the 3rd round through the depression. The position went static. 1 minute 40, Cross said on the channel. Not a complaint, just information. The 4th position was the one she had flagged as a probable on the eastern slope, the one showing the suppressed thermal signature consistent with practice concealment. It had not fired yet, which told her something critical it was holding, waiting for the crossing, waiting for the moment the team was most exposed. She found it through movement. A subtle shift in the tree cover 30 meters upslope from where she had originally placed the estimate, which meant the individual had repositioned during the first 2 exchanges. Repositioned to a better angle on the extraction vehicle. She was not looking at a guard. She was looking at a trained shooter who understood exactly how rescue operations worked and had positioned himself to make certain the last phase of the extraction failed. Observer 1, 1 minute, Cross said. The shot was longer than comfortable in gusting conditions, with the thermal overlay now showing degraded accuracy due to temperature drop. Owen called the correction with the precision of someone who had spent 7 years doing exactly this, in conditions that made Montana in November look mild. She held the correction. She waited for the calm. The calm came. The 4th shot landed. Moving, she told Cross immediately. Take your crossing now. Eastern slope is clear. Northern ridge is suppressed. Move. And then Holloway's voice came through. 3-second delay. Clear for the first time in 4 minutes, Observer 1. I am ordering you to cease fire immediately. Stand down. Stan Cross didn't wait for the order to complete. He moved. The crossing took 19 seconds. She tracked it through the optic cross, supporting Reeves on the right, two agents flanking, Holt running point toward the vehicles, the hostage geologists moving between agents. 19 seconds of open ground in a storm that was starting to push real snow now, horizontal and stinging, reducing visibility by the second. They made it to the vehicles. And that was when Rachel realized she had been wrong about the seventh position. It was not on the ridge. It was not on the eastern slope. It was not in any of the places her analysis had suggested. It was exactly where she had said it might be in Owen's car 2 days ago, looking at a broken branch on a western slope photograph and saying quietly, somewhere that looks already accounted for. The mine office window. The light changed inside the building. Not visible to the naked eye at that distance in that weather, but through her optic, at the specific angle her position gave her relative to the second floor window on the left side, the angle that the designated spur position would not have provided, but the modified position she had requested and been denied, was sitting in right now. She saw it. The cracked glass, the condensation shift, not frost this time. An absence of frost on a 2-inch section of the lower pane where breath, or rather body heat, was warming the surface from inside. Someone was at that window. Someone who had been holding position for hours, waiting for exactly this moment when the team was at the vehicles, when the extraction was almost complete, when everyone's attention was on the ridge and the slope and the hostages crossing the open ground. The mine office had a line on the vehicle staging area. "Owen," she said. Her voice was completely level. Later, Owen would tell people that what struck him most about that moment was not the shot, but the voice, the absolute steadiness of it, the way it carried nothing except information. "Mine office, second floor, left window. Someone is preparing to fire on the vehicle staging area." Owen had the spotting scope on it in 4 seconds. "I don't have a clear visual." "I do," she said. The window moved. The crack in the glass shifted fractionally, the kind of shift caused by a hand, a barrel, a body pressing toward the opening with an intention. She had already made the decision. She had made it 2 days ago in Helena, sitting across from Owen with a protein bar and a notebook and a photograph of broken branches, when she had said, "I'll make a decision and I'll accept the consequences." The final shot was the quietest of all. Or maybe the storm had simply gotten loud enough that everything beneath it sounded like silence. The window went still. Rachel kept her crosshair on it for 4 full seconds, watching for movement. Nothing. The cracked glass caught the gray light and held it, and beyond it, the mine office was dark and motionless. Owen's voice was barely above a whisper. "Rachel, I see it," she said. She kept the optic on the window for another 3 seconds. Then she heard Daniel Cross on the emergency channel, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone who has just come through the far side of something that could have ended differently. "All 3 hostages are loaded. Reeves is stable. We are ready to move. Observer 1, we are ready to move." She exhaled. "Go," she said. The vehicle started. Through the optic, she watched them pull out of the staging area, tires spinning briefly on the frozen ground before catching, moving away from the basin on the western service road, the one she had identified from a satellite photograph of broken branches 11 days ago. The one that led away from the storm and toward the border, and in the opposite direction of every concealed position that had been waiting for them. The basin went quiet. The snow was coming harder now. Real snow, the kind that stays, the kind that covers things and changes what a place looks like and makes it difficult later to explain exactly what happened and where. Owen lowered his spotting scope. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. She noted this without judgment, because her own hands had their own story to tell, and she wasn't interested in comparing them to anyone else's. 7, he said finally. Just the word, just the number. 7, she confirmed. She did not take her finger from the trigger guard immediately. She followed the protocol scan, verify, clear the way she had been taught, the way she had practiced, the way she would continue to practice, because the protocol existed for a reason, and the reason didn't change, just because the immediate threat was resolved. When she was satisfied, she safed the rifle, lifted it from the bipod, and set it beside her. Holloway's voice came through the emergency channel one more time. The delay had cleared. His transmission was clean and immediate. "Status. Basin is clear," she said. 7 positions engaged. All 3 hostages are mobile, departure confirmed. Assault element is on the extraction route. No friendly casualties. A pause, long enough that Owen looked at her sideways. "Observer 1, Holloway said, and then for a moment, nothing. Just the sound of the storm and the channel static and the distance between a ridge in Montana and a command post in Helena. Maintain position until all elements are accounted for. Then return to staging point. Yes, sir, she said. She picked up her notebook. In the cold, with the storm pressing down on the basin below her, and the 7 positions distributed across the landscape in their various states of stillness, she opened to a clean page and began to write. Time, temperature, wind conditions, sequence of engagement, duration of each shot, distance, correction factors. Every radio transmission she had sent and every response she had received logged in exact words to the extent she could recall them, noted as approximate where she could not. She wrote it all down, not because she was proud of it, not because she was afraid of what came next, because the truth was a thing you had to carry carefully, and the best way she had ever found to carry it was on paper, in her own hand, in the neat and precise notation that she had been developing since she was 23 years old and had understood, somewhere in the back of her mind, that the moments when the truth mattered most were also the moments when people most wanted to look away from it. She wrote until Owen said quietly, "We should start the descent. The storm's closing." She wrote one more line, closed the notebook, put it in her kit bag beside the rifle case, beside the thermal overlay unit, beside the emergency rations she had not touched and would not touch until they were off the ridge. Then she stood up, shouldered the pack, and started down the slope. Behind her, the basin was disappearing into the snow. Below her, somewhere on the western road, 3 people who had not expected to see their families again were being carried toward warmth and light. And in a command post in Helena, Montana, a man who had spent 26 years trying to control every variable was sitting with the knowledge that the thing that had saved his team was the one thing he had never been willing to trust. Rachel did not smile. She walked down the mountain in the dark, her notebook in her kit and her rifle on her back, putting one foot in front of the other, the way she had always done, the way she would always do. That was enough. For now, it was enough. The descent from the ridge took 41 minutes. Rachel counted every step, not from anxiety but from habit. The same habit that made her count her breathing and count her round expenditures and count the seconds between transmissions. Counting was how she stayed present in her body when her mind was already somewhere else. And right now her mind was at the command post in Helena, running through every radio transmission she had sent and every response she had received, building the timeline of the next several hours with the same methodical attention she had given to building the timeline of the operation. Owen was 2 steps ahead of her on the slope, and he hadn't spoken since they started moving. That was fine. Owen understood silence, the way field people understood it, not as absence but as a kind of communication. What he wasn't saying, she could read anyway. He was doing his own accounting, his own version of the notebook. They reached the valley floor at 847. The storm was fully committed now, the snow horizontal and insistent, reducing visibility to 40 yards on the open ground near the staging area. The convoy vehicles were still where they had been left, their windshields iced over, the tire tracks from the assault element's departure already filling in. Rachel brushed the snow from the vehicle door, got in, set the rifle case in the back, and sat for a moment with both hands on her knees before reaching for the ignition. Owen got in the passenger side and pulled his door shut. The sound of the storm dropped to a muffled hiss. "You know what's coming," he said. It wasn't a question, yes. "You want to talk through it?" "Not yet." She started the vehicle. "I want to get back to the post first." He nodded. He understood that too. They drove in silence for 20 minutes, following the fire access track back toward the main road, the vehicle rocking through the frozen ruts, the heater working steadily against the cold that had settled into everything. Outside, the storm was erasing the basin, filling the tracks, smoothing the ridgelines, covering the places where things had happened with a clean and indifferent white. She thought about the 7 positions, not about whether she had been right to engage them. That question would be answered by other people in other rooms over the coming days. And she had made her peace with that. She was thinking about them the way she always thought about decisions after. The way a doctor thinks about a surgery or an architect thinks about a structure, looking for the places where she might have done it differently. Not out of regret, but out of the professional obligation to learn everything possible from every situation. The 3rd shot. The northern ridge, eastern cluster. She had waited for a gust cycle before firing, which was correct. But she had waited for the first calm, and in retrospect, the second calm, which came 8 seconds later, would have given her a marginally better wind condition. Would it have changed the outcome? No. Was it worth filing away? Yes. The 6th shot. the eastern slope, the position that had been waiting for the vehicle crossing. She had taken that shot at the outer edge of her comfortable range in deteriorating visibility. It had connected cleanly, but the margin was thinner than she would have preferred. That was a function of the modified position she had been denied from the alternate spur. 40 meters north, the angle would have been 15 yards shorter and the visibility marginally better. She wrote that in her head for the formal report. The seventh shot. She didn't second-guess the seventh shot. She would think about it again, because she always thought about every shot again. But the mine office window, the condensation shift, the fractional movement of the cracked glass, she had been right. And she had been right in time, and that was the only thing that mattered about the seventh shot. What she was still turning over was the timing, 7 positions. She had identified 5 in her pre-mission analysis, confirmed 4 with thermal on the ridge, found the 5th and 6th through movement during the engagement, and found the 7th through a detail so small that most people, she included herself honestly in this, would have dismissed it as atmospheric. The condensation change on a cracked window at 400 yards in a storm. The reason she hadn't dismissed it was because she had been specifically watching for it. Because she had told Owen 2 days ago that the 7th position was somewhere that looked already accounted for. She had been looking for the thing that didn't fit in the place that seemed like it fit perfectly. If she had not been looking for exactly that, Dr. Arthur Reeves and the 2 geologists and 6 federal agents would have been in the vehicle staging area when that window opened. She pulled onto the main road and accelerated south toward Helena. The snow was lighter here, away from the basin, the storm still approaching, but not yet arrived in full force. The road was clear enough to move at speed. At 931, her phone rang. The screen showed Daniel Cross. She answered on the vehicle speaker. Cross. His voice was different from the channel voice she had heard in the basin, less compressed, less managed, carrying something that had been underneath the professionalism the whole time and was only now finding space to surface. We're 20 minutes out from the post. Reeves is stable. The medic says his knee is damaged. He took a fall during the initial detention, been walking on it wrong for 3 days. He's going to need surgery, but he's going to be fine. Good, she said. Both okay. Cold, dehydrated, scared. Mostly scared. Park, the younger one. James Park, he asked me in the vehicle, whether we got everyone out. I told him yes. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, I heard the shots from the ridge. I counted. There were 7. And he just nodded like he'd already done the math. She said nothing. 7. Cross said again. Rachel. I heard the count. Another pause. She could hear the vehicle noise on his end, the same storm muffled by glass and metal. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. I need to tell you what it looked like from inside the building. When we found the room empty, the first room, the room we were supposed to find them in, I had maybe 4 seconds before I understood what it meant. And in those 4 seconds, what I thought was, she was right. That's what I thought. Not about the hostages, not about the positions. Just, she was right, and we came in anyway. Rachel kept her eyes on the road. I didn't say that to blame Holloway, Cross continued. I'm saying it because you should know that when things went wrong, the first clear thought I had was about your analysis. Because your analysis was the most accurate piece of information anyone gave us before this operation, and the fact that it wasn't sufficient to change the plan is something I'm going to have to sit with for a long time. You should write that down, she said. Exactly as you just said it. I intend to. He was quiet for a moment. How are you? The question was simple and direct in the way that field people ask questions after operations, not politely, but genuinely. Meaning, what is your actual state? Not the professional state, not the post-mission report state. I'm writing things down, she said. He understood what that meant. Okay, I'll see you at the post. He hung up. Owen was looking at the road. After a moment, he said, 7 positions and Reeves is going to walk again. That's the math. That's the math, she agreed. The command post was a rented facility outside Helena, a converted logistics building with a gravel lot, temporary communications equipment, and the particular atmosphere of a place that had been set up quickly and would be taken down just as quickly. When they pulled in at 952, 3 other vehicles were already there. The assault element had beaten them by 40 minutes, using the more direct western road. The lot was quiet, cold. A communications specialist was outside running cable, his breath steaming in the air. He looked up when they pulled in and then looked away, which told Rachel something about the mood inside the building. She got out, shouldered her kit, took the rifle case from the back seat, and walked to the entrance. Holloway was inside, standing at the central table with a phone pressed to his ear and his free hand flat on the tabletop, fingers spread, the posture of a man anchoring himself. He saw her come through the door. His eyes stayed on her for exactly 3 seconds. Not accusatory, not grateful, just looking. The way you look at something that has altered the situation in a way you're still incorporating. And then he went back to his call. She found an empty section of table on the far side of the room, set down her kit and rifle case, and sat down. She opened her notebook. She wrote the arrival time, 9:52. She wrote the weather conditions outside. She wrote the state of the communications equipment she could observe from her position. She wrote the number of personnel visible in the room and their approximate positions. Methodical, precise. Everything documented. At 1003, Daniel Cross came in with Brennan and Holt behind him. Brennan was still in full kit, which suggested he hadn't had time to change or hadn't wanted to. Holt was carrying a coffee and looked like a man who had decided that coffee was the appropriate response to surviving something that might have gone differently. Cross made eye contact with Rachel across the room, held it for a moment, then went to find Holloway. She heard fragments of their conversation, not deliberately, just because the room was not large and the acoustics were hard. Cross's voice was low and even. Whatever he was saying was measured and careful. Holloway responded in the same register, which surprised her slightly. She had half expected Holloway to be louder, but he wasn't. He was controlled in the way of a man who had moved past the immediate operational crisis and was now in the territory he knew best, the careful, deliberate process of accounting. At 1017, Holloway ended his phone call and walked directly to where Rachel was sitting. She closed her notebook and looked up at him. He stood across the table from her for a moment without speaking. She didn't fill the silence. She had learned early in her career that filling a silence you hadn't created was a way of giving away something you needed to keep. The formal review process will begin when we're back at Quantico, he said. I want your body camera recording, your observation log, and a complete written timeline of every transmission you sent and received on both the tactical and emergency channels. Everything time-stamped. I have it, she said, or I will have it. I'm completing the log now. Good. He paused. I'm also going to need your personal notebook. She looked at him steadily. My notebook is a personal document. It contains my working observations in private notation. I'll provide a formal log of all operational decisions and transmissions. The notebook may be relevant to the review. If the review board requests it under formal discovery, I'll comply. She held his gaze. But I won't surrender a personal working document voluntarily on the basis of an informal request at a temporary command post. Holloway's jaw tightened slightly. Not anger, something more complicated. He was a man who was used to full compliance, not because he demanded it inappropriately, but because most people facing his seniority and his history simply gave him what he asked for. Rachel was not most people, and she was not giving him the notebook. And he was realizing that the conversation he thought he was controlling had its own architecture. You disobeyed a direct order, he said. I declared an immediate threat to life under active threat protocol and engaged a confirmed hostile position, she said. That distinction will matter to the review board. The protocol requires supervisor authorization in non-imminent scenarios. The protocol permits field agent discretion in scenarios where a hostile action is in progress and communication with command is compromised. She said it without heat, the way she might have quoted a mileage reading or a temperature. The communications repeater was offline. The drone feed was jammed. The emergency channel was on a 3-second delay. The Northern Ridge position was repositioning for an active firing solution on the assault elements extraction route. All of that is in my log. Holloway was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and his voice had changed slightly, not softened, not warmed, but shifted to a frequency she had not heard from him before. The frequency of a man who was setting aside the performance of authority and speaking from somewhere underneath it. How many did you identify before we entered the basin? 5 confirmed positions, she said. 2 additional probables. The mine office as an unconfirmed interior suspect. 7 positions total, identified before we went in. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. You said 6 in your transmission at 0611. I said minimum 3 confirmed, 1 on the eastern slope, and flagged the mine office separately as unconfirmed. 6 was the aggregate of confirmed and probable. I was explicit about the distinction. I know what you said, he said quietly. I reviewed the transmission log before you arrived. She waited. My decision, he said, and the words came out slowly, like something he was carrying a long distance. To proceed without additional reconnaissance after your 614 analysis, that decision will be in the review as well. She said nothing. She didn't nod, didn't acknowledge it, beyond the simple fact of listening. She wasn't going to make this easier for him, and she wasn't going to make it harder. She was going to let him carry it exactly as heavy as it was. If the drone had not been jammed, he continued, we would have had visual confirmation of at least 3 of those positions within the first 60 seconds of aerial coverage. That would have changed my authorization calculus. Yes, sir, the jamming was anticipated by the group. It was part of their plan. Yes, sir, I believe so. He looked at the notebook in her hands. Then he looked at her face. Whatever he was looking for, or whatever he found, he didn't share. He simply said, complete your log. We'll debrief formally at Quantico, and he turned and walked back to the central table. Owen materialized beside her approximately 30 seconds after Holloway walked away, which was the Owen Mercer version of giving someone space 30 seconds, not 30 minutes, because field people didn't have the luxury of extended processing time, and he knew she didn't want it anyway. He asked for the notebook. Owen said, flat, not a question. I declined. Owen said nothing for a moment. Then smart. She picked up her pen and went back to writing. At 1044, a vehicle arrived from the medical facility, where the hostages had been taken for initial evaluation. Dr. Arthur Reeves had asked, apparently with some insistence, according to the agent who delivered the message, whether he could speak briefly with the team before they departed. The medical staff had cleared a 10-minute window. Holloway approved the request. Rachel was not going to go. She had no particular need to be thanked, and she was still working through her log. And there was something about the ritual of gratitude that she had never been comfortable with, not because she didn't care, but because the caring felt too private to perform in front of a room full of people. But Daniel Cross stopped by her table on his way out and said quietly, without making it a request, he asked specifically for you, Rachel. He said, and I'm quoting the one on the ridge, I need to see that person. He somehow knew. She looked up. How did he know there was someone on the ridge? He said he counted the shots. And he said they came from a direction that couldn't have been any of the agents he'd seen enter the building. Cross paused. He's a doctor. He pays attention to things. She closed her notebook and stood up. The medical facility was a community clinic 12 minutes from the command post. The agent drove her and Cross in silence. The parking lot had 4 bureau vehicles in it and a local police cruiser parked at the far end standard presence for a federal incident resolution, there to ensure continuity but not involved in the substance of anything. Dr. Reeves was in a room with a single window. His left knee was immobilized and elevated. His face carried 3 days of beard and the particular hollowed look of someone who has been operating at maximum adrenaline for an extended period and is only now beginning to feel the weight of what they've been carrying. He was 61 years old, but he looked older by a decade in the fluorescent light, sitting up in the clinic bed with his hands on his knees and his eyes very alert. When they came in, his eyes went directly to Rachel. He looked at her for a moment, the way she had looked at the mine office window, with complete, quiet attention, the attention of someone verifying something they already believed to be true. Then he said, "You're the one who was on the ridge." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not overcome, he was too composed for that, even now. He was a man who had spent 30 years watching people at the worst moments of their lives and had learned to carry things without letting them knock him over. But there was something moving behind his eyes that was too large and too honest to be entirely concealed. "I heard the first shot," he said. "We were still in the shed. They moved us back there after the agents came into the building. I heard it, and I heard the second one, and I started counting. Because when you're in a situation like that, and you hear shots that aren't aimed at you, you count. You count because each shot is a piece of information, and information is the only thing you have." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I counted 7. And then I heard Daniel Agent Cross. I heard his voice on the outside of the shed door, and I knew we were going to be all right, but only because of the 7. Cross was standing near the door. He wasn't looking at the doctor. He was looking at the wall, and his jaw was very set. "I have 2 grandchildren," Dr. Reeves said. He said it simply, without drama, the way you say the most important fact about yourself when you've been in a place where that fact seemed uncertain. "For my daughter's kids. She lives in Missoula. I talked to her this morning. She cried for about 10 minutes and I let her, because she'd earned it." Rachel sat in the chair beside his bed. She had not intended to sit. But something about the way he was speaking made standing feel like the wrong posture, like she was holding herself above the moment instead of being inside it. "She asked me," Reeves continued, "how I was alive. And I told her the truth, which is that I don't entirely know. I know we were moved back to the shed. I know the agents came through the door. I know we went across some open ground and got into a vehicle. Some of that is still blurry, partly because of the cold, and partly because of the knee, and partly because that's what fear does to memory. He paused. But I remember the shots. I remember counting them. And I remember understanding, at number 4 or 5, that whoever was doing this was not shooting randomly. They were shooting at specific things, making specific decisions. She said, "That's accurate." He nodded. I thought so. He looked at her for a long moment. "Were you authorized to do what you did?" The directness of the question surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have. He was a physician. He was accustomed to asking the question that mattered, rather than the question that was comfortable. She took a moment to answer, honestly. There was a protocol that permitted what I did under specific conditions. Whether those conditions were fully met is part of what the formal review will determine. But you weren't explicitly authorized by your commanding officer. No, he absorbed that. And you did it anyway. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've made decisions like that. Not in the same circumstances, but situations where the protocol said one thing and the room in front of me said something else, and I had to decide which one I was actually responsible to." He paused. "I've never once regretted doing the right thing when it cost me something. I've regretted the other direction." Rachel looked at the immobilized knee. She thought about him walking on it wrong for 3 days in a cold shed, not complaining. Not because he was trying to be stoic, but because there wasn't anything useful to be done about it, and he understood that. "I'll need to ask you something," she said, "and I need an honest answer." "All right. Did you hear gunfire from inside the building, from the mine office?" "Near the end." He frowned slightly. "There was one more shot, after the others had stopped. It was different, not from the same direction." "What made it different?" He thought about it carefully. "It came from closer, from inside the settlement, not from the ridge." And it was, he paused. Choosing the word, it was final. Like a period at the end of a sentence. And after it, everything stopped. She nodded once. "That one scared me the most," he said. "Because by then I thought it was over. I thought we were moving. And then one more shot." "I know," she said. He held her gaze. "Was that the one that mattered most?" She didn't answer immediately. She thought about the mine office window, the condensation shift, the fractional movement of cracked glass, the calculation she had made in less than 2 seconds. "They all mattered equally," she said. "The first one just as much as the 7th. He accepted that. He seemed like a man who understood that kind of answer, who recognized it not as deflection but as precision. When they left the clinic, Cross walked with her to the vehicle and stood for a moment before getting in. The snow was tapering off, the storm beginning to exhaust itself, the sky over Helena going from flat gray to a lighter gray that suggested the afternoon might have some pale light in it. He said, "The review board is going to be thorough." "I know. Holloway will submit his operational log, his version of the authorization timeline." "He should," she said, "and mine will be complete." Cross looked at her sideways. "Are you worried?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I'm not worried about the truth. The truth is documented." She paused. "I'm concerned about what happens after the truth. That's a different thing." He nodded slowly. "The outcome matters to the people who come after you," he said. "You know that." "I know that," she agreed. "Which is why the process has to be right, not just the outcome. If the board clears me because we succeeded, that's not a precedent that helps anyone. It has to be cleared, because the decision was defensible on the merits. Because the protocol, properly understood, allowed what I did. And if it didn't, she got into the vehicle. Then I accept the consequence," she said. "And I know the difference between rule that failed and a person who failed." Cross got in and closed the door. They drove back to the command post in the thinning snow, and Rachel opened her notebook and wrote down what Reeves had said about the shots and what it had felt like from inside the shed. And she wrote it because it was part of the factual record of the operation, and because the factual record was what she had, and what she had was what she intended to protect. At 1148, Holloway called the full team together in the main room for a preliminary debrief. Standard post-operation protocol, not the formal review. Just the immediate accounting. The first pass through the timeline while everything was still fresh. He stood at the head of the table and went through it chronologically. The deployment, the staging, the assault element movement, the communications failure, the drone loss, the engagement sequence. He was precise. He gave credit where it was factually due. Cross for the hostage extraction. Brennan and Holt for covering the crossing, the communications team for maintaining the emergency channel under difficult conditions. When he reached the engagement sequence on the ridge, he paused. The room was quiet in a way that was different from the operational quiet. This was the quiet of 20 people holding their breath. Observer 1 identified 7 hostile positions prior to and during the assault phase, Holloway said. 5 were identified in pre-mission analysis. 2 were identified during active engagement. Observer 1 engaged all 7 positions without explicit authorization under emergency protocol declaration, citing compromised communications and imminent threat to life. He paused again. The formal review will determine whether the protocol was applied correctly. That review has not occurred yet, and I will not prejudge it. He looked at Rachel across the table. What I can say, as a matter of operational fact, is that the engagement sequence on the ridge created the conditions that allowed the assault element to complete the extraction. That is in my log. The room was still quiet. Then Holt said, from the far end of the table, in the direct and slightly flat way that people spoke when they were saying something important and didn't want it to sound like a speech. With respect, Commander, I was covering the left flank during the crossing. The eastern slope position, the one that was waiting for us, I never saw it. I was looking and I couldn't find it. And then it wasn't a problem anymore. He paused. I have 2 daughters. I just want that in the record somewhere. Nobody said anything. Holloway looked at Holt for a moment. Then he looked at his operational log. Then he made a note. The debrief concluded at 1,224. The team began packing down the temporary post for transport back to Quantico. The communications equipment came down. The tables were cleared. The tactical maps were rolled and secured. The temporary facility returned to what it had been before they arrived. A converted logistics building with a gravel lot and fluorescent lights, and the particular emptiness of a space that had briefly mattered and was now releasing whatever it had held. Rachel packed her kit and loaded the rifle case into the vehicle. Owen was doing the same, methodical and quiet, the same way he did everything. She was closing the vehicle door when Holloway appeared beside her. Not the commanding position he was standing at the same level. Not across a table, not at the head of a room, just beside her in the parking lot with the tapering snow and the pale light trying to find its way through the cloud cover. Bennett, he said. She stopped and looked at him. He was carrying something. She could see it in the set of his face, the particular weight of a man who has been holding something for a very long time and is finally adjusting his grip, not letting go, not yet, but acknowledging that the weight is there. The analysis you submitted before the briefing, he said. The pre-mission terrain assessment, the vehicle route identification, the thermal pattern interpretation, the position estimate. He stopped, looked at the gravel, looked back at her. I read it again at 0900 after we were back at the post. I read it the way I should have read it the first time. He paused. It was accurate. Every primary conclusion was accurate. She said nothing. I'm not telling you that too. He started, then stopped, then tried again. I'm not telling you that as an apology. I'm telling you because it's a fact that belongs in your operational record. She looked at him for a moment. The man who had stood in front of a briefing table and said, in front of every evaluator at Quantico, that she was not ready. The man who had put her on an observer spur and told her to report threats she was not permitted to engage. The man who had, somewhere under all of that, been trying to protect people from a fear he had never found a way to name. Thank you, Commander, she said. And then because it was also a fact, the analysis was complete as of 72 hours before deployment. There was time for additional reconnaissance. He absorbed that. He didn't. There was, he said. There will be a formal finding on that point. I know. He turned to go, then stopped. Turned back. Something shifted in his face, not softening, exactly, but the particular expression of a man releasing something he has been holding in his jaw for years. The 7th position, he said, the mine office. That wasn't in any of your written analysis. No, she said. It was a field observation. I flagged it on the tactical channel at 0623. I know, I've reviewed the log. He looked at her directly. How did you find it? She thought about the cracked window, the condensation shift, the 2-inch section of glass that had changed temperature for less than a second, the conversation in Owen's car about broken branches, and a place that looked already accounted for. I was looking for it, she said simply. I had told myself before we deployed that whatever I expected, the most dangerous position would be in the place I had already dismissed. So I kept going back to the places that felt settled. The mine office was the most obvious structure in the settlement, which made it the first thing I stopped looking at. So I looked at it again. Holloway was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's not in any training manual I've written." "No, sir," she agreed. "It isn't." He nodded once slowly, turned, and walked back to his vehicle. Owen was leaning against the passenger door of their vehicle, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the exchange without apparent interest in its content. When Holloway's vehicle started and pulled away, Owen said, "What did he say about the seventh position?" He asked how I found it. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." Owen considered this for a moment. "Is that going to help you or hurt you at the review board?" She thought about it. "I don't know," she said, "but it's what happened." He nodded and got in the vehicle. She stood in the parking lot for another moment. The storm had broken enough that she could see the mountains north of Helena, the ridgeline they had come down 6 hours ago, already white with fresh snow, the basin invisible behind it, everything that had happened there, disappearing quietly under the kind of cover that the Montana winter applied to things without asking permission. She thought about the 7 positions. She thought about the notebook in her kit bag. She thought about the formal review that was coming, and the questions that would be asked, and the answers she had, and the ones she didn't. She thought about Holt's daughters. She thought about Reeves's grandchildren. She thought about the 7-year-old in Missoula who didn't know yet that her grandfather had nearly not come home from a county flood assessment and who would grow up without ever knowing how close it had been, which was exactly how it should be. She got in the vehicle. Owen handed her a thermos without being asked. She took it, and they pulled out of the lot and headed south through the lightening sky. Behind them, the mountains held their positions, silent and enormous, the way they had been before any of this began and would be long after, indifferent to the particular weight of what 7 shots and 1 notebook and 1 woman's refusal to stop watching had changed in the world below them. She unscrewed the thermos cap and drank. Then she picked up her pen and wrote the final entry in the operational log, departed command post, Helena, MT, 1241. All personnel accounted for, mission complete. She underlined the last 2 words. Then she closed the notebook and held it on her knee and watched the road ahead. The flight back to Quantico took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Rachel spent most of it with her notebook open and her pen moving, not because there was anything left to document about the operation itself, but because the formal written timeline required a level of precision that benefited from multiple passes. She read through what she had written, checked it against her memory of the radio transmissions, cross-referenced the timestamps, and anywhere she found ambiguity, she flagged it with a small mark in the margin and wrote a note explaining what she knew for certain and what she was reconstructing from partial information. She did not overstate anything. She did not understate anything. She wrote it the way she had been trained, to write operational reports with the understanding that the person reading it would be looking for the places where language tried to do the work that facts couldn't, and that those were the places where credibility collapsed. Owen was asleep across the aisle. He had been asleep within 20 minutes of takeoff, which was a field skill Rachel had always admired in him, the ability to identify a window of safety and use it completely without apology. She had tried to sleep and found she couldn't. Her mind was doing what it always did after a significant operation, running and rerunning the sequence, not obsessively but systematically, the way you run a diagnostic on a system that has been under stress to make sure everything is still functioning as designed. Holloway was at the front of the aircraft with the tactical lead and the communications specialist, going through the operational log on a laptop. She could see the back of his head from where she sat. He had not moved from that position since they boarded. She had no way to know what he was writing or what he was deciding to include versus what he was deciding to frame. That was his right. Every person involved in the review would submit their own account, and the board would build the composite picture from all of them together. That was how it was supposed to work. She trusted the process. Not blindly, she had been in the bureau long enough to know that process was only as reliable as the people administering it, and that people sometimes protected each other, and sometimes protected institutions, and sometimes simply made mistakes. But she trusted it more than the alternative, which was no process at all. And she had built her career on the belief that documented truth, presented without embellishment, was the most durable thing she could offer. The plane landed at Quantico at 1847. Cold Virginia evening, the kind that carried the memory of autumn without any of its color. The tarmac was empty except for 2 waiting vehicles. Nobody from the Bureau's administration was there to meet them, which was appropriate. The formal process had not yet begun, and appearances before the process suggested conclusions before the evidence. She loaded her kit into the vehicle, said goodnight to Owen, and drove herself to the barracks. She showered, changed, ate a protein bar because it was in her kit, and she had not eaten since the middle of the previous night, and sat at the desk in her room with the notebook and the formal timeline document side by side. She spent 2 hours on the final version of the timeline. When she was done, she read it once more from the beginning, slowly, as if she were a board member reading it for the first time without context. She was looking for anywhere it could be misread, anywhere ambiguity could be exploited, anywhere a reasonable person might draw a conclusion she did not intend. She found 3 places, and revised the language in each one, not to soften anything, but to be more precise. At 2,214, she printed 2 copies. One went into a sealed envelope for the review board. The other stayed in her possession. Then she opened her notebook to the last written page and added one final entry, timeline completed and verified. Ready for formal review. She closed the notebook. She turned off the light. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the Quantico facility distant vehicle movement. A door closing somewhere down the hall, the particular ambient hum of a large institution that never fully went quiet. And she thought, for the first time since leaving Montana, about what came after the review, not the outcome. She had made her peace with the range of possible outcomes before she took the first shot. What she was thinking about was the larger question, the one that the review board would not be asked to answer, the one that didn't fit on a timeline or in an operational log. What did it mean that she had been right about everything? And it had nearly not been enough. She had identified the positions. She had communicated them clearly. She had documented every warning. She had followed every step of the protocol available to her, right up to the moment when the protocol ran out, and she had to make a decision with her own hands and her own judgment. And even then, even with perfect preparation and accurate analysis and correctly executed engagement, it had come down to a crack in a window and a half-second of condensation that most people would have looked straight through. What would have happened if she had not been looking for exactly that? What would have happened if the 7th position had been 2 feet to the left, outside her angle of coverage from the position she had been assigned? She lay in the dark and let those questions exist without trying to resolve them. Some questions didn't have answers that fit neatly in a notebook. Some questions were just the shape of the risk that the work carried, and the only honest response to them was to acknowledge their size and keep going. She fell asleep sometime after midnight. At 800 the following morning, she received formal notification that the review board would convene in 72 hours. The board would consist of 5 members, a deputy assistant director from the operational division, 2 senior tactical supervisors from outside Unit 7, a legal counsel from the Bureau's standards office, and this was the part that surprised her slightly, an independent representative from the oversight panel that monitored hostage rescue team operations. The independent representative was unusual. It suggested that someone above Holloway's level had taken an early interest in the case, which could mean several different things depending on who had made the request and why. She sent Owen a text, board composition is unusual. Independent oversight rep included. His response came back in 4 minutes, I know. Heard last night. Could be good, could be complicated. Probably both. She put the phone down and went to the range. Not to shoot. She ran the dry drills that she ran every morning, regardless of operational status movement, positioning, breathing cycles, the mechanical routines that kept the physical side of the work in calibration, regardless of what was happening in the institutional side. She ran them for 90 minutes, alone in the cold morning air, and the familiarity of the routine was its own kind of steadiness. She was on the return walk to the barracks when Daniel Cross fell into step beside her. She hadn't heard him approach, which told her either that she was more distracted than she thought, or that Cross was much quieter than his build suggested. Probably both. Morning, he said. Morning. He walked beside her for a moment without speaking, which, with Cross, meant he was organizing something he wanted to say and making sure he had it right before he said it. She gave him the time. I submitted my operational statement last night, he said finally. I want you to know what's in it. She looked at him. You don't have to tell me. I know I don't have to. He kept his eyes forward. I told you before we deployed that I trusted your judgment. I'm not in the habit of saying things I don't mean, so I want you to know that what I submitted reflects that. I documented the exact sequence when I received your assessment, what it said, what the plan was, what happened when we found the first room empty, and what I observed from the assault element's position during the engagement sequence. Did you include the transmission delay? She asked. Every second of it, he said. And I included my interpretation of the emergency protocol. I believe and I stated that the conditions you described in your declaration, compromised communications, active hostile repositioning, imminent threat to the extraction route, met the threshold for field agent discretion. She was quiet for a moment. That's your read of the protocol. It is. And I've been doing this for 16 years, so the board will have to decide how much weight to put on that. They walked for a while in silence. The morning was cold and clear. The kind of cold that came after a storm system had moved through and left everything wrung out and sharp-edged. She could see her breath. What about Holloway? She said. Cross considered the question carefully, the way he considered most things. He's a thorough man, he said. His report will be accurate. He won't misrepresent the timeline. He won't say things that aren't supported by the log. A pause. But accurate and complete aren't the same thing. A man can tell the truth and still choose which truths to put at the front of the story and which ones to put at the back. I know, she said. His core argument will be protocol, Cross said. That you were not authorized, that the conditions for emergency discretion were ambiguous rather than clear, and that the outcome does not retroactively justify the decision. He will be technically correct about the ambiguity. There is space in the protocol language for reasonable disagreement. Rachel felt the familiar weight of it settle back onto her shoulders, not heavier than before. Just present again, after the brief suspension of forward movement. He's right that there's ambiguity, she said. The protocol doesn't say imminent in absolute terms. It says in progress. Whether repositioning for a firing solution constitutes in progress is genuinely arguable. It is, Cross agreed. Which is why what Reeves says is going to matter. She looked at him. Reeves doesn't have standing to testify about protocol interpretation. No, but he has standing to testify about what he experienced. And what he experienced is a man who was in a room about to be cut off by a vehicle position that you stopped before it fired. He can testify to the sequence of shots from inside the shed. He can testify to what he believes would have happened if the seventh shot had not been fired. Cross paused. The board can't ignore a victim witness, especially one who's a physician with 30 years of community credibility. I don't want the outcome to rest on gratitude, she said. I said that in Montana and I meant it. If the board clears me because the hostages are alive and people feel good about it, that's not a precedent. That's just luck wearing the shape of a decision. Cross stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He looked at her directly. You know what separates you from most people I've worked with, he said. Not rhetorical. Actual question waiting for an answer. Tell me, she said. Most people in your position right now are thinking about themselves. Whether they're going to be cleared. Whether their career survives. Whether the people who doubted them are going to have to admit they were wrong. He held her gaze. You're thinking about the precedent. You're thinking about the next person in this position who might not have your scores or your documentation or your particular set of 7 positions to point to. You're thinking about whether the rule itself gets fixed or just the outcome. She looked at him. Isn't that the only thing worth thinking about? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in the particular way of a man who has just confirmed something he already believed. I'll see you at the board, he said, and turned and walked back toward the operations building. She watched him go for a moment. Then she turned back toward the barracks, walking into the sharp, clear cold of the post-storm morning, and she thought about the rule. The 72 hours before the review board convened were the longest of her career. Not because of anxiety, she had moved through anxiety in Montana, somewhere between the 6th and 7th shot, and come out the other side of it into the territory that existed past the point of no return, where the only honest response to a situation was to be completely present in it. But because 72 hours was a long time to carry something in stillness, she trained. She ran. She went to the range and ran the dry drills and added some live fire because she wanted to understand whether what she had done in Montana had changed anything in her mechanics. It hadn't. 7 shots at extreme range in a storm, and her fundamentals were exactly what they had been before she left, which was not self-congratulation, but simply the confirmation that training was doing what training was designed to do. Owen found her at the range on the 2nd day and sat beside her on the bench while she cleaned the rifle. He didn't say anything for a while. Just sat there in the easy way of someone who understood that presence was sometimes more useful than words. The independent oversight rep, he said finally. I found out who it is. She looked up. Margaret Okafor, he said. She was on the panel that reviewed the Chicago incident 3 years ago. the one where a tactical commander withheld a threat assessment from his team and 2 agents were injured. Rachel set the cleaning rod down carefully. What was the finding? Structural failure in the authorization chain, Owen said. The commander was cleared of personal misconduct, but removed from field command pending leadership evaluation. The panel recommended revisions to the communication failure protocol. He paused. Okafor wrote the minority report arguing the revisions didn't go far enough. Rachel looked at the rifle. She thought about the Chicago incident. She had read the summary, hadn't read Okafor's minority report because she hadn't had a reason to at the time. Now she had a reason. Can you get me the minority report? Already in your inbox, Owen said. Sent it 20 minutes ago. She read the minority report that evening. Twice. Okafor's argument was methodical and precise, not emotional, not political, but structurally rigorous in the way that the best institutional critiques were rigorous. She had argued that the protocol revision failed to address the core problem, which was not the communication chain itself, but the authorization structure that allowed a single commander's fear-based judgment to override verified field intelligence in a compromised communications environment. Sound familiar, Rachel thought. She read it a third time and made 3 pages of notes. The review board convened at 900 on the 4th day in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the operations building. The room had a long table, 8 chairs, and the particular fluorescent stillness of official proceedings. Rachel arrived 8 minutes early, which was 4 minutes later than she normally arrived for things that mattered, because she had decided on the walkover that arriving too early would look like anxiety, and she wasn't anxious. She was ready. The board filed in at precisely 900. Deputy Assistant Director Warren first, then. The 2 tactical supervisors, one of whom Rachel recognized from a joint training exercise 2 years earlier, a woman named Collins, who had the direct, evaluative gaze of someone who made decisions based on what she observed rather than what she expected. Then the legal counsel, a man named Garrett, who carried a folder thick enough to suggest he had read everything. Then Margaret Okafor. Okafor was in her mid-50s, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She sat down, opened her own folder, put the glasses on, and began reading without speaking to anyone, which Rachel took as a sign that she had already formed a substantial part of her view and was checking it against the documentation, rather than constructing it from scratch. Holloway came in last, which surprised Rachel until she understood that he was there as a witness and respondent, not as a board member. He sat at the far end of the table away from the 5 board members, and he did not look at Rachel when he sat down. She did not look away from him. She looked at him steadily until he met her eyes, briefly, and then she looked at Deputy Assistant Director Warren. Warren opened the proceedings with the formal language incident designation, date, participants, purpose of the review. He read through the operational timeline at a measured pace, not rushing, making sure the sequence was established clearly before anyone began responding to it. Then he looked at Rachel. Agent Bennett, please confirm that the operational log and timeline you submitted are complete and accurate to the best of your knowledge. They are, she said, and you maintain that your declaration of emergency field discretion at 06. He checked his notes. 0617 was consistent with your interpretation of Bureau Protocol, Section 12, Subsection 4C. I maintain that the conditions I observed and documented met the threshold described in that section, she said. I also acknowledge that the section contains language that is subject to reasonable interpretation, and I welcome the board's determination on that interpretation. Collins leaned forward slightly. Agent Bennett, walk me through the 7th position specifically, the mine office. That was not in your pre-mission analysis, and it was not confirmed by thermal or drone coverage at any point. Walk me through the decision to engage. This was the question that mattered most. Rachel had known it was coming, and she answered it exactly as she had lived it: the condensation shift, the optic angle, the conversation in Owen's car about the place that looked already accounted for, the half-second of movement at the cracked glass. When she finished, Collins was quiet for a moment. That is an exceptionally thin basis for a lethal engagement, she said. A factual observation. Yes, Rachel said. It is. And if I had been wrong, I would be sitting here having a very different conversation. I was not wrong. And the reason I was not wrong is that I had specifically told myself, before we deployed, to go back to the places I had already dismissed. Because I had identified theoretically, not with confirmed data, that the most dangerous position in the layout would be somewhere that looked already accounted for. You prepared yourself to look for your own blind spots. Collins said. Yes. Can you teach that? The question landed in the room differently than the others had. Warren looked up slightly. Okafor, who had not yet spoken, turned a page in her folder. I believe so, Rachel said. Not the specific observation. The habit. The practice of going back to the thing you've already categorized as safe and asking why you're sure. Okafor spoke for the first time. Her voice was measured and direct. The voice of someone who had sat in a lot of rooms like this one. Agent Bennett, did Commander Holloway have access to your full pre-mission analysis before the operation briefing? Yes, Rachel said. And to your knowledge, did he order any additional reconnaissance based on that analysis? No. Was there time to conduct additional reconnaissance before the deployment window closed? Yes. Approximately 31 hours between the submission of my analysis and the deployment. And in those 31 hours, no additional reconnaissance was ordered. Not to my knowledge. Okafor wrote something. Thank you. Then Warren turned to Holloway. Commander Holloway, in your operational log, you describe Agent Bennett's pre-mission analysis as, quote, a credible but unverified inference pattern requiring drone confirmation before operational adjustment. Can you explain your decision not to order additional reconnaissance in the available window? Holloway had been waiting for this. He was composed. She had to give him that. His voice was level when he spoke. The pre-mission window also required the team to complete final equipment checks, communications integration with the temporary command post infrastructure, and personnel positioning. An additional reconnaissance flight in that window would have required diverting the secondary drone from its planned approach corridor and accepting an elevated risk of detection in the target area. He paused. I assessed that the operational risk of early detection outweighed the unverified risk identified in Agent Bennett's analysis. And in retrospect, Warren said, a pause, a genuine one, not a calculated one. Rachel could tell the difference by now. In retrospect, Holloway said slowly, the analysis was accurate, and the reconnaissance should have been ordered. The room absorbed that. It was not the admission of a man who had been broken by the process. It was the admission of a man who had looked at the documented evidence and could not, in honest conscience, reach any other conclusion. That distinction mattered to Rachel more than she had expected it to. The board recessed at 1,147 and resumed at 1,330. In the interim, Rachel ate half a sandwich in the hallway and stood by a window and watched the Quantico grounds in the cold afternoon light and thought about nothing specific. She had said everything she had to say. The rest was the board's work, and she respected it enough to let it be done without trying to influence its direction. The afternoon session was shorter than the morning. The board had questions for Owen, who answered with the characteristic precision of a man who had spent 7 years in Army reconnaissance and understood that the difference between a useful report and a useless one was the discipline to say only what you knew and label clearly what you inferred. His account of the ridge sequence, the wind corrections, the spotting calls, the exact words Rachel had spoken. Before each shot, it was a transcript more than a testimony, and the board listened to it with the attention it deserved. Then Garrett, the legal counsel, asked the question that Rachel had been expecting since she first read the board's composition. Agent Bennett, he said, looking up from his folder, Section 12, Subsection 4C required, and I'm quoting directly, that field agent discretion may be exercised in scenarios where hostile action is actively in progress and communication with command authority is operationally compromised. The word actively. He looked at her. At the moment of your first engagement, the Northern Ridge position was repositioning. It had not fired. Does repositioning constitute hostile action actively in progress? She had thought about this question for 4 days. Repositioning in preparation for a firing solution, she said carefully, on a defined target, a target that consists of federal agents and civilian hostages in an active extraction is, in my reading of the protocol, a component of a hostile action that is in progress. The hostile action did not begin when the first shot was fired from the basin. It began when the positions were established to trap the team. The repositioning was a phase of that action, not its initiation. She paused. If the protocol requires me to wait for the shot before I can respond, then the protocol has a gap, because the shot from that position would have ended the extraction before any response was possible. Garrett looked at her for a long moment. Then he wrote something in his folder. The board recessed a second time at 1,518. They did not reconvene that day. Warren informed the parties that the board would issue its findings within 48 hours. Rachel walked out of the building into the late afternoon and stood in the cold air for a moment, letting the institutional atmosphere of the conference room dissipate. Owen was waiting near the building entrance, his hands in his pockets, which was his resting state when he was not actively doing something. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Finished," she said, "in the sense that I've said everything there is to say. That's usually either a good sign or a very bad one." "I know." She looked up at the sky, which was going dark early the way it did in November, the last light pulling back from the horizon. Garrett's question about actively. That's the hinge. If they read the protocol narrowly, I violated it. If they read it functionally, what it was designed to protect against, I didn't. Owen was quiet for a moment. "Okafor's minority report," he said. "Yes. She's been arguing for a functional reading of that section for 3 years. I know." Rachel pulled her collar up against the cold. "But she might also argue that the protocol needs to be rewritten rather than reinterpreted, which gives me credit for the right instinct and still finds against me on the letter of the rule. Would you accept that finding?" She thought about it, honestly, the way she thought about most things completely, without softening it for the sake of comfort. "Yes," she said. "If the rule genuinely doesn't cover what I did, and I genuinely violated it, then I accept the finding. And then the rule should be changed, so the next person isn't in the same position." Owen looked at her for a long moment. "You know, most people in your situation would be focused on getting cleared. Full stop. Most people don't have 7 positions documented in a pre-mission analysis that nobody acted on," she said. "The clearance is only one part of what needs to happen here." He nodded slowly. "All right. Buy you dinner while we wait for the world to end?" She almost smiled. "Sure," she said. They walked. The 48 hours that followed were not quiet. On the evening of the first day, a story appeared in a regional Montana outlet about the operation attributed to unnamed sources, containing no classified details, but establishing the basic outline of what had happened and mentioning that a female agent had engaged hostile positions from a ridge position. By the following morning, it had been picked up by 2 national outlets. By afternoon, the Bureau's Public Affairs Office had issued a standard no comment pending investigation response, which was the right response, and also the response most likely to accelerate public interest. Rachel didn't read any of it. Owen sent her one text, "It's out there. You should know," and she responded, "I know, thank you," and went back to the range and ran the drills and let the institutional machinery do its work. On the morning of the second day, she received a call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, but something about the timing made her pick up. It was Margaret Okafor. Not calling as a board member that would have been inappropriate during the deliberation period. And Okafor was not the kind of person who did inappropriate things inadvertently. She called as herself. The way the call was framed immediately and explicitly. "I am not calling about the board's deliberations," Okafor said without preamble. "I am calling because I reviewed your pre-mission analysis this morning, and I want to ask you a question that has nothing to do with the review." Rachel was at her desk. She sat up slightly, "All right. When you wrote the section on the mine office," Okafor said, "you noted it as an unconfirmed interior suspect and then specifically said, and I'm quoting from your document, this position is excluded from thermal and satellite analysis and should be treated as a zero data unknown. Why did you include it at all if you had no data to support it?" Rachel thought about this. Because having no data about a position isn't the same as having data that the position doesn't exist, she said. Zero data is information. It tells you that your surveillance method has a gap, and a gap in surveillance coverage at a tactically significant structure is a threat in itself, regardless of whether there's a confirmed presence. A long pause on the line. "That's not standard threat assessment methodology," Okafor said. "No," Rachel agreed. "It's what I do when standard methodology leaves a question open." Another pause. "Would you be willing, after the board process is complete, to present that methodology formally to a panel? Not about this operation specifically, about the methodology itself." Rachel looked at the notebook on her desk. "Yes," she said. "I would." "Good," Okafor said, and then the call ended as abruptly as it had begun. Owen, when she told him, stared at her for 3 full seconds. "She called you during deliberations to schedule a methodology presentation. She was very specific that it wasn't about the deliberations." "She called you during deliberations," Owen repeated, as if the second iteration would change the content. "Owen, that's Okafor telling you something, I know," Rachel said. "But I'm going to let the board tell me officially before I start building on it." He sat back. "Fair enough." The board's findings arrived at 9:30 on the morning of the third day, delivered in writing to all parties simultaneously. Rachel opened the document at her desk alone with the notebook beside her and a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she was waiting. She read it completely before she reacted to any part of it. The board found, in 6 pages of precise and careful language, the following: that Agent Rachel Bennett had violated the explicit authorization requirement of standard protocol by engaging hostile positions without supervisor command authority, that this violation was material and on the record, and that an official reprimand would be entered into her permanent file. The board also found, in the following 4 pages, that the conditions Agent Bennett had identified and documented, specifically the compromised communications state, the active repositioning of the hostile Northern Ridge element, and the imminent threat to the extraction route, met the functional threshold of the emergency field discretion provision, properly interpreted against the provision's stated protective purpose rather than its precise literal language. The board further found that Commander Holloway's failure to order additional reconnaissance during the 31-hour pre-deployment window, in the presence of a formally submitted threat analysis that subsequently proved accurate in all primary conclusions, represented a command judgment failure that contributed materially to the operational crisis. Commander Holloway was removed from field command pending mandatory leadership evaluation and would not return to tactical operational authority without board recertification. The board additionally recommended, in language that bore the clear imprint of Margaret Okafor's minority report from the Chicago incident, that Section 12, Subsection 4C of the Tactical Protocol be revised to clarify the definition of hostile action in progress in environments where communications failure is a confirmed or anticipated operational condition. Rachel set the document down. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk, on either side of the notebook, in the quiet room, with the cold coffee and the November light coming through the window. The reprimand was in her file. That was real. That would be there for the remainder of her career, visible to every review board and every promotion panel and every commander who pulled her record. She had known it was coming and she had accepted it before the first shot was fired, and she accepted it now with the same steadiness. She had violated the protocol as written. The board said so, and the board was right. She was also cleared of reckless conduct. That was real too. Not cleared because the hostages survived, not cleared because Reeves had grandchildren, and Holt had daughters, and Daniel Cross had trusted her judgment. Cleared because the evidence, documented in her own hand over 11 years of careful and methodical work, demonstrated that every decision she had made was built on verified information and responsible discipline. She picked up her pen. She opened the notebook to the next clean page. She wrote the date and time. Then she wrote the board's finding in 2 sentences: reprimand for unauthorized engagement, cleared of reckless conduct, and she underlined both of them once, the same way she had underlined mission complete at the end of the operational log. Then she wrote, beneath the underlines, 3 words that she did not underline and did not intend to share with anyone but herself. She wrote, the rule matters, because it did. It mattered that there was a rule. It mattered that the rule had a gap in it, and it mattered that the gap was going to be addressed, and it mattered that the addressing of it had not required her to be wrong, or her commander to be simply evil, or the process to collapse into sentimentality about outcomes. It mattered that the system had looked at what happened and said, here is where it failed, and here is why, and here is what will be different. She closed the notebook. She called Owen. He picked up on the second ring, and she read him the key findings without commentary. And when she was done, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to be meaningful. Reprimand and cleared, he said finally. Yes. Holloway, removed from field command, pending leadership evaluation. How do you feel? She thought about it. Really thought about it, the way the question deserved, without rushing to an answer that was easier to say than to mean. Like it landed where it was supposed to land, she said. The reprimand belongs there. The clearance belongs there. Holloway's evaluation belongs there. A pause. And the protocol revision, that's the one that matters most. Because of the next person, Owen said. Because of the next person, she confirmed. She heard him exhale, not dramatically. Just the steady sound of a man who had been holding something and was letting it go in the normal, undramatic way that people let things go when the weight is finally resolved. Buy you dinner, he said. Yeah, she said, but this time I'm buying. She put the phone down, picked up the notebook, and put on her jacket. She walked out of the barracks into the cold Quantico afternoon, the grounds spread out around her, the range in the distance, the operations building where the board had sat for 2 days, making the careful and imperfect an essential determination of where the lines were and what they meant. She walked across the grounds without hurrying. Behind her, in the room she had just left, the notebook sat on the desk with its last entry visible. The date, the finding, the 3 words at the bottom of the page, the rule matters, and then the blank space below it, waiting for whatever came next. The reprimand arrived in her official file on a Tuesday. Rachel knew the exact moment it posted because the Bureau's personnel system sent an automated notification to her account at 847, the same way it sent notifications about training schedule updates and annual review deadlines and changes to the health insurance enrollment window. One email among the day's administrative traffic, subject line, personnel file update administrative action. She opened it, read the 1-paragraph confirmation, closed it, and went back to the range. She ran the drills for 2 hours. The same drills she had run the morning before the board convened, the same drills she had run the morning after, the same drills she had been running every morning for 11 years. The reprimand was in her file. That was permanent. That was real. And the drills were also real. And the muscle memory was real. And the 11 years of accumulated precision that had put 7 rounds into 7 specific targets in a Montana storm was as real as anything the personnel system had ever recorded about her. She held both truths without needing to resolve the tension between them. That was the work she had decided years ago. Not eliminating the tension, learning to carry it without letting it change the aim. 2 days after the reprimand posted, Margaret Okafor's office sent a formal request. Not a suggestion, not a preliminary inquiry, a formal request on Bureau letterhead for Agent Rachel Bennett to participate in a working group convened by the Oversight Panel to review tactical protocol language in Section 12 and its related subsections. The working group would include representatives from the Legal Standards Office, 2 senior tactical supervisors, a communication specialist, and a trauma physician who consulted on field medical protocols. Rachel read the letter twice. Then she called Owen. Okafor's working group, she said when he picked up. I know, he said, I got a copy. They want me to. Spotter perspective on the communications failure section. She was quiet for a moment. She's building the revision from the operational record. That's what it looks like. It's the right approach, Rachel said. The protocol gap wasn't theoretical. It happened in a specific sequence of specific decisions under specific conditions. The revision should come from that sequence, not from someone sitting in a conference room, hypothesizing about what might go wrong. She knows that, Owen said. That's why she called you during deliberations. Rachel set the letter on her desk beside the notebook. She looked at them side by side, the institutional language of the formal request and the handwritten lines of everything she had documented over 4 operations in 11 years and one particular night on a Montana ridge. When does the group convene? 3 weeks, Owen said. Quantico, then a follow-up session in Washington. I'll be there, she said. She was there. The working group met for the first time on a gray December morning in the same building where the review board had sat, though in a smaller conference room with a round table instead of a rectangular one, which Rachel suspected was deliberate on Okafor's part. Round tables implied equivalence. They implied that everyone present was there to contribute information rather than to establish hierarchy. There were 8 people at the table. Okafor, who opened without ceremony and got to the substance within the first 4 minutes. 2 tactical supervisors, Collins, whom Rachel recognized from the board, and a man named Reyes who had 15 years in HRT and the evaluative quietness of someone who formed opinions slowly and held them firmly. The legal counsel Garrett, who had a new folder and seemed more relaxed than he had been at the review board, which suggested he was more comfortable in the construction phase than the adjudication phase. A communications specialist named Park, not the geologist. A different Park, who had been the one working the degraded emergency channel during the Montana operation, and who had a very clear and detailed memory of exactly how the 3-second delay had functioned in real time. The trauma physician, a woman named Dr. Sandra Cho, who had spent 12 years consulting on field medical protocols, and who said almost nothing in the first hour and everything in the second, and Owen, who sat beside Rachel and had his own notebook open. And Rachel, Okafor began with the Montana operational timeline. Not as a point of blame, the board had handled blame, and the working group was not a relitigation of that, but as a case study. The sequence of decisions, the communications failure, the authorization gap, the field discretion declaration, the outcome. She laid it out with the same precision she brought to everything, and she asked the group a single question when she finished: where does the current language fail? For the next 6 hours, they answered that question. It was the most technically demanding conversation Rachel had participated in since her first year at Quantico, when she had been the youngest person in every room and had spent most of her energy demonstrating that she belonged there. This was different. This time she was not demonstrating anything. She was contributing. There was a distinction, and it mattered in ways she hadn't fully anticipated until she was sitting at the table with 7 other people who were all operating from the same assumption that she was there because she knew something worth knowing. The protocol language that Garrett had quoted at the review board, hostile action actively in progress, became the center of the discussion. Garrett argued, precisely and without personal investment, that the current language was ambiguous because it had been written to address a scenario-type active shooter engagement that did not map cleanly onto the ambush scenario type, where the hostile action was sequential and phased rather than immediately overt. Collins argued that the ambiguity was, in certain respects, intentional, that the architects of the original language had not wanted to define the threshold so specifically that it created a checklist that could be gamed in either direction, either by a field agent looking for a narrow justification or by a command authority looking for a narrow grounds for denial. Reyes said almost nothing for 90 minutes. Then he said, the problem isn't the language. The problem is that the language assumes a functioning communication channel. Every ambiguity in that section is resolvable if you can actually talk to the person you're asking permission from. The language fails specifically, and only when the channel fails. So the question isn't what actively in progress means. The question is what authorization looks like when the channel that authorization requires is gone. The room was quiet. Owen wrote something in his notebook. Rachel watched him write it and recognized from the angle of the pen that it was the same thought she had just had. Dr. Cho spoke for the first time in the meeting. In trauma medicine, she said, we have a doctrine called presumptive consent. When a patient cannot communicate unconscious, incapacitated, in a condition that prevents meaningful consent, a physician may proceed with necessary treatment under the presumption that a reasonable person in that situation would consent. The presumption is rebuttable if the patient later demonstrates otherwise. But in the absence of communication, the physician does not wait, because waiting has its own consequences. She looked at Okafor. You need a tactical equivalent. The room absorbed that. Rachel looked at Dr. Cho across the table. The physician looked back at her with the calm, direct attention of someone who had arrived at a conclusion through a completely different route and was pleased to find it was the same conclusion. Presumptive authorization, Rachel said. Under defined conditions, Garrett said immediately, with clear documentation requirements. Which Agent Bennett fulfilled, Collins said. Not defensively, just noting the fact. Which the protocol should require of any agent invoking it, Rachel said. The documentation requirement is what makes the presumption rebuttable. Without documentation, it's not a protocol. It's just a field agent doing whatever they want and citing necessity afterward. Garrett was writing. Define the conditions, he said. They defined them. For 3 hours, the 8 people at the round table built the framework, not the specific language. That would take additional drafting sessions and legal review, but the structural logic. The 3 conditions that would need to be simultaneously present: confirmed or objectively probable communication failure, objectively identifiable hostile action in an advanced preparatory or active phase, an immediate and documentable threat to life that could not be addressed through any available authorized channel within the time available. And the documentation requirement: body camera, observation log, transmission record, and a written declaration of the conditions as observed at the time of the decision, not reconstructed afterward. Rachel had fulfilled all of those requirements in Montana. Not because she had anticipated this exact revision, because she had been documenting everything since she was 23 years old and had understood that documentation was the most durable protection available to someone whose judgment would always be questioned first and credited last. At 1748, Okafor closed the session. She thanked the group and told them the next session would be in Washington, 6 days out, and that Garrett's office would circulate a draft framework for review before then. People began gathering their materials. Conversations broke into smaller pieces, Reyes talking to Collins, the communications specialist talking to Garrett, Dr. Cho writing something in her own notebook. Okafor came around the table and stopped beside Rachel. The presumptive authorization framework, she said. The case studies we'll use to illustrate it in the revised protocol, Montana will be one of them. I know, Rachel said. Your operation will be in the training curriculum. not as an example of a violation, as an example of the gap the protocol failed to address. Okafor paused. How do you feel about that? Rachel thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. I feel like the reprimand and the case study can coexist, she said. I violated the protocol as written. That's in my file. And the protocol as written had a gap that I fell into. That'll be in the curriculum. Both of those things are true. Neither one cancels the other. Okafor studied her for a moment. You know what the hardest thing in institutional reform is? Tell me. Convincing people that accountability and systemic change are not competing values. That you can hold an individual to the standard that existed, while also acknowledging that the standard was inadequate. Most people want one or the other. The reprimand without the revision, or the revision without the reprimand. She paused. You're comfortable with both. I think the discomfort is the point, Rachel said. If it was easy to hold both, it wouldn't mean anything. Okafor almost smiled. It was a contained expression, the smile of a woman who had trained herself to be careful about what she showed in professional rooms. But it was there. 6 days, she said, Washington. I'll be there, Rachel said. The Washington session produced the first draft of the revised language. It went through 4 more revisions over the following 8 weeks, each one circulated to a wider group of reviewers, operational commanders, legal analysts, oversight representatives from 3 field offices, a former HRT team leader who had retired 2 years earlier, and brought with him the particular candor of someone who no longer needed to protect their position. Rachel reviewed every draft. She commented on 3 of them, specifically and only on the places where the language drifted from the operational reality she had documented, where the theoretical precision of the drafters began to lose contact, what it actually felt like to be on a ridge in a storm trying to make a decision that the protocol hadn't anticipated. She was careful to distinguish between what she knew from experience and what was generalizable to other scenarios. That distinction, she had learned, was the difference between a useful contribution and a self-serving one. She was not revising the protocol to protect herself retroactively. The reprimand was in her file and it was staying there. She was revising it so that the next person in her position had a clearer framework, and so that the next commander in Holloway's position had a clearer requirement for what to do when a verified threat assessment was placed in front of her. On the morning of the 6th draft review, she received a call from Daniel Cross. Have you heard? He said. Heard what? Holloway completed his first evaluation session, the leadership assessment panel. She had known the evaluation was in progress. It was in the board's finding. It was Holloway's professional obligation. It was the institutional consequence that the system had assigned and that he had accepted without appealing. She had not tracked its progress because it was not her process to track. And she said, he requested a voluntary conversation with the oversight panel. Not required, not scheduled. He asked for it. Cross paused. He said he wanted to provide additional context about the pre-mission decision, the reconnaissance window. Rachel was quiet. He submitted a supplementary statement, Cross continued. I've read a summary. He says in writing that the decision not to order additional reconnaissance was not a judgment call based on operational risk. It was a judgment call based on personal resistance to acting on intelligence he had not generated himself. He attributed it specifically to. Cross paused again, and when he spoke next, his voice had shifted slightly, carrying something more careful than its usual register, to a pattern of discounting field intelligence when it came from sources he had not personally vetted over an extended working relationship. Rachel sat very still. He said your name, Cross said, specifically. He said that his resistance to your pre-mission analysis was influenced by factors unrelated to the quality of the analysis, and that this had been true from the beginning of your assignment to the unit. She did not respond immediately. She looked at the notebook on her desk. She thought about the panel at Quantico, where Holloway had said in front of 7 evaluators that she was not ready. She thought about every briefing where he had dismissed her assessments with precise, reasonable-sounding language that carried underneath it the weight of a conclusion that had been reached before the evidence arrived. You okay? Yes, she said. I'm thinking. Take your time. She thought about it for another moment. Then she said, what happens to his evaluation now? The panel will incorporate the supplementary statement. It changes the nature of the leadership failure. It wasn't just rigid thinking under pressure. It was a documented pattern of bias influencing operational command decisions. Cross paused. He might not come back to field command, even after the evaluation. She absorbed that. Is that what he wants? Not to come back? A long pause. I don't know what he wants, Cross said. I think he's figuring out the difference between what he wanted and what he needed. And I think those things are further apart than he expected. She thought about Holloway. Not the Holloway who had dismissed her analysis and denied her the primary designation and stood in front of a team to say she wasn't ready. The Holloway underneath all of that, the man who had stood outside a farmhouse in Roanoke 8 years ago and listened to silence where voices should have been, and had spent every year since trying to build a wall between himself and that silence by controlling every variable he could reach, including her. He made a decision, she said, to submit that statement. Yeah, Cross said. It did. That matters, she said. Not to absolve him. Not to set aside the consequence of what his pattern had meant for the operation and for the people in that basin. But because it was true, and she was in the business of things that were true, it matters that he got there. Cross was quiet for a moment. You're a more patient person than I am. I'm a documented person, she said. Documentation requires patience. He laughed briefly and genuinely, which was the sound of someone releasing something that had been held in the chest rather than the throat. 6 months, he said. 6 months since Helena. You've been cleared, reprimanded, put on a working group, and now Holloway voluntarily rewrites his own story. That's a lot. It is, she said. How are you? She looked at the notebook. She thought about the answer genuinely, because Cross always meant the question genuinely and deserved the same in return. I'm better than I expected to be, she said. The reprimand I thought would feel heavier. It doesn't. It feels like the correct weight for what it is. She paused. The working group is the thing that feels significant. More than the clearance. More than anything else that's happened. Because of the protocol revision. Because of the protocol revision, she confirmed. The clearance is about me. The revision is about the next person. Those aren't the same size. He was quiet for a moment. I told you 6 months ago that the outcome matters to the people who come after you. You did. I was right, he said. But I didn't know yet how many ways that would turn out to be true. She smiled at that. The genuine kind, the kind that wasn't performing anything for anyone, because there was no one in the room to perform for. Thank you for calling, Daniel. Sure, he said. I'll see you at the next working group session. She put the phone down and opened the notebook. She had kept it consistently through the 6 months since Montana, the same methodical entries, the same precise notation, but the entries had shifted in character. Less operational log and more something else. Something she didn't have a clean name for. Notes toward understanding, maybe. The record of a person thinking carefully about what the experience meant and refusing to arrive at easy conclusions. She turned to the current page and wrote the date and time, and then wrote, Holloway supplementary statement submitted. Pattern acknowledged. This is what accountability looks like when it's not forced. She looked at the line for a moment. Then she added, it is not the same as what he did in the basin being acceptable. It is not the same as the reprimand being wrong. It is a separate fact, and it belongs in the record. She closed the notebook. 3 weeks later, she received a message through the Bureau's internal system. No subject line. Sender Grant Holloway. The message was 4 sentences. I read the working group's 5th draft revision. The presumptive authorization framework is sound. The documentation requirement is the right answer to the accountability concern. I should have requested this revision 2 years ago. She read it 3 times. Then she forwarded it to Okafor's office with a single line, for the record. Okafor responded 40 minutes later with 2 words, already noted. The working group's final protocol language was approved at the Bureau, level 7 months after the Montana operation. The revision went into effect immediately for all tactical field operations, with a mandatory training update for all unit commanders within the following 60 days. The case study designated as Incident MT7, the 7 in the designation standing for the number of hostile positions, was incorporated into the Advanced Threat Assessment curriculum at Quantico. Rachel was asked to contribute a section of the curriculum herself. Not as an instructor, not yet, that would come later, but as the agent whose operational record formed the backbone of the case study. She wrote 12 pages. She was asked to expand it to 20. She wrote 20 pages and stopped, not because she ran out of things to say, but because 20 pages said everything necessary. And the discipline of stopping when the content was complete was the same discipline as every other part of the work. On a Friday morning in early spring, 9 months after Helena, she received a call from the Bureau's training division. They were beginning the redesign of the Sniper Observer program. The current program director was retiring, and the division was forming a design committee. Her name had been recommended for the committee by Margaret Okafor, by Daniel Cross, and by the two tactical supervisors from the working group, independently and without coordination. The division chief, a woman named Torres who had been at the Bureau for 22 years and had the direct, unhurried manner of someone who had long since stopped performing authority and simply had it, called herself, rather than delegating the recruitment to an administrator. "I'm not calling to offer you something ceremonial," Torres said. "I want to be direct with you about what this is. The program redesign is substantive. It's going to take 18 months at minimum. It's going to require you to argue for things that will not be popular with some very senior people. And the output is going to carry your name attached to it permanently, which means if something in it fails in the field 5 years from now, your name is on that failure too." She paused. "Are you interested?" Rachel had been standing at the window of her office when the call came in. She stayed at the window. Outside, the Quantico grounds were greening into spring, the first real warmth since November. The kind of morning that reminded you that the cold did eventually end. "Yes," she said, "I'm interested." "Good," Torres said. "First meeting is in 3 weeks. I'll send you the preliminary framework. Read it carefully and come ready to tell me where it's wrong." "I'll bring my notebook," Rachel said. The first meeting of the Program Design Committee took place on a Tuesday morning in the same building, different room, a larger one this time, with whiteboards and a projection screen and a long table with 8 chairs. 7 of them were filled when Rachel arrived. The 8th was hers. She sat down, set her notebook on the table, and looked around the room. The committee members were a cross-section of the Bureau's tactical institutional knowledge, 2 program veterans, a communications specialist, a behavioral analyst, a legal standards rep, a field medical officer, and at the head of the table, Torres. Torres opened without ceremony. "We're not here to fix the program that exists," she said. "We're here to build the program that should exist. The distinction matters. The program that exists was built for a set of assumptions about who would be in it, what the threat environment would look like, and what communications technology would be available. Some of those assumptions are still valid. Most of them are not." She looked at Rachel. "Agent Bennett, I've asked you here first because the operational record in Incident MT7 is the most comprehensive recent documentation of the program's current gaps. Walk us through it." Rachel walked him through it. She spoke for 40 minutes. She covered the pre-mission analysis process, what she had observed, how she had documented it, what she had communicated, and when and where the communication had failed. She covered the engagement sequence on the ridge, not the shots themselves, but the decision architecture that preceded each one, the information she had, the information she didn't have, the framework she was working inside, and the specific places where the framework stopped providing guidance. She covered the 7th position, and she covered the documentation requirement, and she covered what would have happened if she had not been specifically watching for the things she expected to find in the place she had already dismissed. She covered the gap. When she finished, the room was quiet in the productive way, not empty quiet, but the quiet of people who have received more information than they were expecting and are integrating it before responding. The behavioral analyst, a man named Dr. Ferris, who had been in the Bureau for 17 years, said, "You said you had prepared yourself to look for your own blind spots. You said you told yourself, before deployment, that the most dangerous position would be in the place you had already dismissed. Can you teach that?" It was the same question Collins had asked at the review board 9 months earlier. Rachel's answer was the same in substance and more detailed in delivery. "Yes," she said, "not as a specific skill, as a practice. The habit of returning to categories you've already closed. The practice of treating confidence in a negative, 'I looked and found nothing,' as a data point about your search method rather than a fact about the terrain." "How do you train that?" Torres asked. "You build exercises that specifically reward the candidates who go back," Rachel said. "You don't just score the targets they find. You score the process. You look at the sequence of their search, and you identify the moments when they accepted a null result without verifying what generated the null. And then you show them what they missed, and you run it again. You'd need to redesign the qualification exercises significantly," the program veteran on her left said. His name was Chambers, and he had been running the current program for 6 years. He said it as an observation, not an objection. He was a careful man who preferred to understand the implications of a proposal before forming an opinion about it. "Yes," Rachel said, "and the evaluation criteria. Right now we score accuracy and speed. We need to score judgment. We need to score the decision to wait as well as the decision to shoot. We need to evaluate what a candidate does with a null result, not just what they do with a confirmed target." Harder to quantify, Chambers said. Yes, she agreed. But accuracy and speed are also hard to quantify in real field conditions. We quantify them because we've built the tools to do it. We need to build the tools to quantify judgment. Ferris was writing. Torres was watching Rachel with the particular attention of someone who is not forming an opinion, but confirming one they already had. The meeting ran 3 hours over its scheduled time. Nobody left early. By the end of the first session, they had identified 7 core areas where the current program required fundamental redesign: threat recognition methodology, documentation discipline, communications failure protocols, ethical decision-making under compromised authorization, judgment evaluation criteria, spotter-sniper team communication, and candidate psychological preparation for the specific cognitive demands of extended observation under uncertainty. 7 areas. Rachel noted the number and said nothing about it. The following 4 months were the most intellectually demanding of her career. The committee met twice a week, supplemented by individual working sessions between members, field consultations with active HRT unit commanders, and 3 separate review cycles where draft curriculum materials were tested against operational scenarios and evaluated by people who had not been involved in the design. Rachel drove most of the judgment evaluation section herself. It was the hardest part, not technically but conceptually. Building a rubric for something as internally complex as field judgment in a way that was objective enough to be applied consistently across candidates by different evaluators without reducing judgment to a checklist that could be learned and performed rather than genuinely exercised. She went through 11 drafts. She brought each one to Owen, who gave her the kind of feedback she valued, most direct and specific, with no softening for the sake of comfort and no criticism for its own sake. He told her the 3rd draft was too rigid and the 7th draft was too broad, and the 9th was getting closer, but the documentation requirement was still too light relative to the other criteria. She revised on his comments without resentment because he was right on every point. The 11th draft went to Torres with a cover note. This is the best I can build it. It will require evaluators who understand what judgment looks like in order to apply it. That's a training requirement on top of the curriculum requirement. Torres responded, I know. That's why I'm adding evaluator certification to the redesign scope. Good work. On the morning the revised program was submitted for bureau-level approval, Rachel sat at her desk in the early light and opened the notebook to a clean page. She wrote the date. She wrote the program submission date and the version number. Then she wrote the 2-sentence summary of what the new program required: equal standards for every candidate. Judgment evaluated on evidence, not expectation. She stared at the 2 sentences for a long time. Then she closed the notebook, put it in her kit bag, and drove to the range. Not for the drills this time. She had been asked by Torres with the particular directness that characterized everything Torres did to supervise the first trial of the revised qualification exercise. They had built a new version of the nighttime range scenario specifically for this, 7 positions, hidden by the evaluation team, varied after the candidate's study period. No thermal overlay, no drone support. A partial communications disruption built into the scenario design, not as a trick but as a documented condition that the candidate was informed of in advance and had to plan around. 7 candidates had qualified for this first trial. 4 men, 3 women. Their scores on the standard qualification metrics were uniformly high. Torres had been specific about the selection, wanting the first cohort to represent the best the current program was producing, so that the comparison between old and new criteria would be as clean as possible. Rachel arrived at the range 30 minutes before the first candidate. She walked the outer perimeter in the early morning, not to check the target placements. The evaluation team had done that. And it wasn't her role to know the positions before the candidates did, but to understand the light, the wind, the temperature, the particular acoustic properties of that valley in that season at that hour. She always started by understanding what she was working with. At 600, the evaluation team gathered at the command station. Chambers was there, and Torres, and 2 of the program veterans from the committee, and 1 other person who had not been on the original list, Grant Holloway. Rachel saw him from across the station and stopped walking for 1 second, not from surprise exactly, but from the need to absorb the fact of his presence before moving through it. He was in civilian clothes, which told her he was not there in any official capacity. He was there as an observer, if he was there at all, and his standing to observe would have required explicit approval from the program leadership. Torres caught her eye from across the station and gave the small, clear nod that meant, I approved it. he asked. I said yes. Rachel walked the rest of the way to the station at her regular pace. Holloway was standing slightly apart from the group, which was his habit, the particular positioning of a man who had learned that authority required visible separation. But the separation looked different now, not commanding, just uncertain. The posture of a man who was present somewhere. He did not have natural standing and was trying to be appropriate about it. She stopped beside him. "Commander," she said, then corrected Grant. He looked at her. He was older than she remembered, which was an effect of context. He looked different outside the specific room she had always seen him in, without the professional posture that those rooms required. He looked like a man who had spent 9 months doing something difficult and was not finished with it. "I wanted to see it," he said. "The new exercise. Torres said I could observe. She told me." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the range, at the tree line, at the early light moving across the valley. "I read your section of the curriculum," he said. "The judgment evaluation criteria." And he took a moment to answer. "It's right," he said. "The documentation requirement, the null result verification, the process scoring." He paused. "It's the thing I never built a way to measure, because I didn't think it could be measured. I thought it was either there or it wasn't." He paused again, longer this time. "I was wrong about that." She looked at him. "You were wrong about more than that." "Yes," he said, "I was." The acknowledgement landed simply, without performance. It was the acknowledgement of a man who had done the work of understanding what he had done and why, and had arrived at the place where the honest statement of it was no longer painful to make, not comfortable. Honest statements of significant failures are never comfortable, but no longer painful. "I submitted the supplementary statement because it was true," he said. "Not because I thought it would help you or hurt me or change anything about the board's finding. It was true and it belonged in the record." "I know," she said. "I told Cross the same thing when he called me." Holloway looked at her sideways. "You heard about it from Cross?" "Within 2 days." "That's fast." "Daniel Cross is a thorough man," she said. "He values accurate information the same way I do." Something in Holloway's expression shifted very slightly, the small recalibration of a person encountering a version of themselves in a description they didn't expect. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it once, clearly, not as part of any process or review or evaluation, just as myself saying a thing that's true." She waited. "Your analysis was complete and accurate before we ever got on the plane," he said. "Everything you identified was verified by the operation. Everything you warned me about came true. And I did not give you the standing to act on it, not because I had evidence against your judgment, but because I had already decided what your judgment was worth based on things that had nothing to do with your judgment." He held her gaze steadily. "That is not something a commander is allowed to do. And it cost people something, not their lives, because you corrected for my mistake in real time, but something. The certainty of their safety that they should have had and didn't." Rachel listened to all of it. She let it land the way it was intended, not as an apology that resolved anything, because apologies don't resolve operational failures, but as a statement of fact from a man who had arrived, slowly and at genuine cost, at an accurate understanding of what had happened. "I accept that," she said, "and I want to say something in return." He waited. "The work you did in those evaluation sessions," she said, "and the supplementary statement, that's not nothing. Most people, facing what you were facing, find a way to reframe it until it becomes something more comfortable. You didn't do that." She paused. "I'm not telling you that it erases anything. It doesn't, but it matters that you did it. It matters in the record, and it matters here." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the slow nod of a man receiving something he wasn't sure he deserved but wasn't going to refuse. "Thank you," he said, "and nothing else." They stood side by side in the early morning and watched the first candidate arrive at the command station, a young man in his late 20s, dark-haired, moving with the controlled tension of someone who has prepared for something difficult and is very close to the moment of demonstration. He signed in, received his briefing on the communications disruption, and was cleared to enter the range. The valley went quiet. Rachel raised her binoculars. Not to watch the targets, she still didn't know their positions, and that was correct. She watched the candidate. She watched the way he moved his attention across the terrain. What he looked at first, where he slowed down, where he accepted a null result too quickly. 3 minutes in, he engaged the first target. Clean. The evaluators noted it. 4 minutes later, the second. Then a longer pause, a section of the range where he was not finding what he was looking for. She watched him stay still, which was a promising sign. The instinct to rush in a training scenario was the instinct that got people killed in field conditions. and his stillness suggests he understood the difference between urgency and panic. Then he moved his search angle, came back to a section he had already scanned, looked at it differently. Chambers beside her, said quietly. He went back. He did, Rachel said. The third target fell. She lowered her binoculars. He lowered her binoculars slightly and looked at the valley and thought of the first time she had stood in a place this, at 23, running qualifications in August heat, carrying everything she intended to prove and finding out, slowly and over years, that proof wasn't actually the thing that mattered most. The thing that mattered most was the standard itself, its integrity, its consistency, its refusal to bend for expectation in either direction. Holloway was watching the candidate through his own binoculars. His face was calm in the way of a man who is watching something he is no longer responsible for shaping, but still understands deeply. After the fifth target fell, one of the program veterans, a man named Ellis, who had been skeptical of the judgment criteria through most of the design process and had come around to them only after the third evaluation cycle, turned to Rachel and said, "He's going to find all 7. Maybe," she said. "You sound very certain of the maybe." "I'm certain of the standard," she said. "The candidate has to meet it. I don't decide that in advance." Ellis looked at her for a moment. Then he went back to his binoculars, and she thought she heard, very quietly, something that might have been a laugh. The sixth target fell at 11 minutes and 40 seconds into the exercise. The valley went quiet again. The candidate was still. Rachel watched him through the binoculars, and she could see, even at distance, the quality of his attention, focused, still, not rushing, looking for the thing that wasn't where he expected it to be. Holloway lowered his binoculars slightly. Without looking at Rachel, he said, "Where's the 7th?" She knew where she would have put it. She had been thinking about it since she arrived at the range. Not where the evaluation team would put it. She didn't know that. But where she would put it if she were building the scenario to test exactly the habit she had been trying to build into the curriculum. The place that looked already accounted for. The position that was obvious and therefore invisible. She didn't answer Holloway. She watched the candidate. He went back to the section of the range he had cleared first, came to it from a different angle, slowed down, looked at something she couldn't identify from her position, something small, something that had caught his attention in the way that small things caught attention when you had trained yourself to notice what didn't fit. The 7th shot broke the silence. The 7th target fell. The range was silent. The evaluation team noted the time. The program veterans looked at each other. Ellis said nothing, which from Ellis was the loudest possible response. Awesome. Torres walked to where Rachel was standing and stood beside her for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "What do you need to declare the exercise a success?" Rachel thought about it. "I need to see the evaluation scoring," she said. "The judgment criteria, not just the accuracy count. I need to see whether he went back to the null results, how many he verified, what his process looked like between the 5th and 7th positions. If the scoring confirms the process, then the exercise is a success," Rachel said. "Not because he found 7, because we'll be able to document that the program taught him how to find the one that shouldn't have been findable." Torres nodded. She started to walk back toward the command station, then stopped. "Bennett," she said. Rachel looked at her. "You know what changed today?" "The standard," Rachel said. "Not the standard," Torres said. "The standard has always been the same. What changed today is that nobody moved it." She held that for a moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the station, and Rachel turned back toward the range, and the valley was quiet in the clean spring morning, the way it always was after the work was done and before the next candidate arrived. She raised her binoculars one more time. The range was empty now, the targets back in their positions, the candidate already at the command station signing out. Just the valley and the tree line and the early light, settling into all the places where shadows had been. She thought about all of it. The panel at Quantico where someone had said she was not ready. The Montana Basin where 7 positions had been waiting in the dark. The notebook with its 11 years of entries, each one a small, careful act of insisting that the truth belonged somewhere permanent. The working group and the protocol revision and the curriculum. And this morning, this particular morning, standing on a range watching a young man go back to the place he had already dismissed and find what was hidden there. She thought about what Torres had said. Not the standard. The standard has always been the same. What changed today is that nobody moved it. She lowered the binoculars. Behind her, another candidate was approaching the command station. The evaluation team was resetting. The process was continuing, the way the process always continued, indifferent to the specific weight of any single morning and entirely dependent on the accumulated weight of every morning before it. Rachel Bennett turned to face the range and waited for the next candidate to begin. The standard was intact. The standard had always been the only thing worth protecting. And now at last it belonged to everyone.